When I asked about the date of my younger brother's wedding so I could clear my audit schedule, my new sister-in-law flashed her suspiciously gaudy diamond ring and smirked. "We got married yesterday," she announced proudly. "A private yacht ceremony just for special people who fit our aesthetic." 5 days later, she called me in a panic demanding to know if I had transferred their overdue rent money yet, because the building management was threatening eviction. I replied with perfect calm. "Didn't I tell you? Just like your wedding, my money is only for special people." My name is Naomi, 32 years old, and I am a senior forensic accountant managing high-level assets in Atlanta. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who used your loyalty as a bank account while treating you like a second-class citizen. We go straight into the grand dining room of my parents' sprawling estate in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. It was a typical Sunday dinner, which in my family meant a heavily curated production designed to maintain the illusion of absolute perfection. My father Desmond and my mother Vivian were not just regular attendees of the largest megachurch in the city. They were the undisputed pillars of it. They sat on the executive boards, hosted the lavish charity galas, and obsessed daily over projecting an image of flawless Black excellence. Everything in their house reflected this exhausting obsession, from the imported Italian marble floors to the custom crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, expensive glow over the catered dinner spread. But beneath the polished veneer of Sunday service hats, perfectly tailored designer suits, and practiced smiles, the emotional reality of our family was suffocating. I had always been the outsider in my own home. I was practical, analytical, and emotionally disciplined. I built my career from the ground up, dealing in hard numbers, fraud investigations, and financial realities. I did not care about designer labels or keeping up appearances for people I did not even like, which made me a constant, bitter disappointment to my mother. In her eyes, a successful daughter was one who married into the right influential family, attended the right elite social events, and smiled effortlessly for the cameras. Instead, all of my parents' pride, affection, and financial support were poured blindly into my younger brother, Trevon. At 28 years old, Trayvon was the undisputed golden boy of the family. He called himself a tech entrepreneur, but in reality, he was a smooth-talking grifter who jumped from one failed startup to another, entirely funded by the bank of mom and dad, and frequently me. Trayvon had the natural charisma that made people gravitate toward him, a perfect blinding smile, and an uncanny ability to spin his repeated failures as temporary genius setbacks. And then there was his new fiancée, Chantel. At 27, Chantel was a social media influencer who masqueraded as an old-money socialite. She carried herself with an unbearable arrogance, constantly name-dropping luxury brands and looking down her nose at anyone who did not fit her carefully curated high society aesthetic. I saw right through her facade from day one, recognizing the desperation behind her designer posts. But my parents were completely blinded by the illusion she projected. They believed Chantel came from a highly influential generational wealth family, and they were desperate to secure that social alliance to boost their own standing in the church community. The tension at the dinner table that evening was palpable, but my mind was focused on a very specific financial transaction I had completed just before arriving. Just 2 hours prior, Trevon had pulled me aside with a desperate, panicked look in his eyes. He begged me for a $15,000 loan, claiming it was an absolute life-or-death emergency to secure the luxury venue deposit for his upcoming wedding. He promised the funds would be reimbursed as soon as his latest venture capital round closed next week. Being the older sister and despite my professional instincts screaming at me that something was wrong, I transferred the $15,000 directly into his account to save the family from the social embarrassment he claimed was imminent. Now, sitting at the long mahogany table passing the roasted asparagus and prime rib, I decided to ask about the logistics of the event I had just funded. "So, Trevon," I said, setting my crystal glass down on the table, Now that the luxury venue deposit is officially secured, what are the actual dates for the wedding? We are entering the fourth quarter soon, and my auditing schedule at the firm is going to be incredibly brutal. I need to block out the calendar right now, so I do not have any conflicts with your big day. The clinking of silver forks against fine china suddenly stopped. A heavy, intensely uncomfortable silence descended over the sprawling dining room. Trevon suddenly looked very interested in his mashed potatoes. Avoiding my gaze completely, his jaw clenched tight. My father shifted uncomfortably in his ornate chair, suddenly coughing into his linen napkin and looking toward the kitchen. It was Chantel who broke the suffocating silence. She leaned back in her chair, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her perfectly contoured face. She raised her left hand purposely, catching the chandelier light on a massive, suspiciously gaudy diamond ring that looked more like costume jewelry than a genuine high-grade stone. "Oh," Naomi Chantel said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and thick condescension. "You do not need to worry about clearing your busy little corporate schedule. We got married yesterday." I froze. The words echoed in the quiet, opulent room, ringing in my ears. Yesterday I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. Chantel let out a light, airy laugh that grated violently against my nerves. "Yes, yesterday," she announced proudly. "We decided to have a highly exclusive private yacht ceremony on the lake. It was incredibly intimate and absolutely breathtaking. We wanted to keep the guest list strictly to special people who truly fit our aesthetic and social standing. My parents flew in and your parents were there, of course. It was just a very high society vibe, you know, the kind of thing you cannot just invite anyone to." My brain, trained for years to analyze data, trace hidden funds, and detect corporate fraud, instantly connected the dots with devastating clarity. The $15,000 I had transferred just 2 hours ago was not for a future venue deposit. It was a reimbursement to cover the immediate expenses of a luxury yacht wedding that took place the day before. A wedding I was deliberately, maliciously excluded from. I had just unknowingly funded the very event that banned me for not being deemed good enough to attend. I slowly turned my gaze to my parents, expecting them to show an ounce of shame, a flicker of guilt, or perhaps offer an apology for attending a wedding that deliberately excluded their own daughter. I expected them to reprimand Chantel for her blatant, cruel disrespect right to my face. Instead, my father took a slow, deliberate sip of his ice water and looked out the window. My mother Vivian met my eyes with a chilling, absolute lack of remorse. She elegantly dabbed the corners of her mouth with a cloth napkin before speaking, her posture rigid and unyielding. "Now, Naomi, do not make a big deal out of this and ruin our Sunday dinner," Vivian said, her tone laced with that familiar patronizing edge she reserved specifically for me. "You have to understand Chantel's position. Her parents are very prominent, wealthy people, and they have certain expectations for how things should look. Your energy is always so stiff and corporate. You never dress the part, you do not mingle with the right elite crowds, and you are always so negative and calculating about money. It just did not match the high society aesthetic they were going for. We did not want you sitting in the corner looking judgmental and making Chantel's family uncomfortable on such a perfect day. You should be happy for your brother instead of selfishly making this about you." My own mother was looking me in the eye and telling me that my practical, hard-working nature was a social liability. They viewed me as nothing more than a peasant relative, a convenient walking ATM, to blindly fund their elite fantasies, but an embarrassment to be hidden away when the cameras were flashing and the important people were watching. The sheer breathtaking audacity of their hypocrisy hung heavy in the air. They were sitting in a luxury house partially paid for by my financial advice, drinking expensive wine bought with my hard-earned money, celebrating a marriage underwritten by my bank account, and having the nerve to tell me I was socially unfit to stand beside them. Chantel sat there smirking, clearly expecting me to burst into tears, to scream in outrage, or to beg for their acceptance, as I might have done when I was a desperate younger woman seeking her family's love. She wanted the satisfaction of watching the uncool corporate sister break down in a fit of jealousy and inadequacy. But I was not that broken girl anymore. I was a senior forensic accountant who ruthlessly tore apart million-dollar corporate frauds for a living. I did not deal in tears, tantrums, or emotional outbursts. I dealt in receipts, paper trails, and cold consequences. I looked around the large table at the people who were supposed to be my family, feeling the last remaining threads of familial obligation dissolve into nothingness. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not shed a single tear. I simply smiled. It was a cold, bright, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. "I understand completely," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and smooth. "You wanted a specific aesthetic. Congratulations to you both." I picked up my heavy linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it perfectly next to my untouched plate of food. I pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "Thank you for dinner, Mother. I think I will head home now." I walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking rhythmically and sharply against the marble floor, echoing through the grand foyer. I did not look back, not even for a second. I walked out the heavy front doors, stepped into the cool, crisp Atlanta evening air, and unlocked my sleek sports car. As I slid into the driver's seat, the absolute silence of the car wrapped around me like a protective shield. I started the engine, the low purr filling the space, but I did not put it in drive right away. My mind was completely clear, stripped of any lingering guilt or sadness. The emotional attachment to these people had just been severed permanently, leaving behind only the cold, hard logic of an investigator on a mission. They wanted to play high society games using my money. It was time to see exactly how much of their perfect, curated life actually belonged to me. I reached into my designer bag, pulled my phone out, and opened my secure corporate banking app. My forensic accountant instincts were fully awakened, and the investigation into my own family had officially begun. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the cold leather grounding me, as the heavy doors of my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate shut behind me. I did not turn the key in the ignition right away. I did not cry, and I certainly did not reach for my phone to vent to a friend. My mind was already categorizing data, stripping away the emotional weight of my family and treating them as subjects of a high-stakes financial audit. My forensic accountant instincts had fully taken over. I unlocked my phone and opened my secure corporate banking app, the bright screen illuminating the dark interior of my car. I needed to see the damage. I put the car in drive, the engine humming quietly, and navigated the winding suburban roads back toward the city. The drive to my sleek downtown Atlanta condo was a blur of neon city lights and rhythmic highway lines. I bypassed the kitchen entirely when I walked through my front door, ignoring the low hum of the refrigerator, and headed straight into my home office. This was my absolute sanctuary. 3 high-resolution monitors sat on a massive glass desk, flanked by stacks of encrypted hard drives and secure server tokens. I powered up my primary workstation, the soft blue glow illuminating the dark, quiet room. I took off my blazer, draped it over the back of my ergonomic chair, and sat down. I cracked my knuckles, pulled up my custom accounting software, and began the meticulous process of pulling data files from every personal and shared account connected to my name. I needed a complete, unvarnished picture of exactly how much money I had injected into this toxic family over the past 5 years. Vivian had called me stiff and corporate just an hour ago. It was time to see exactly what that corporate energy had actually paid for. I started by aggregating the wire transfers, categorizing every bank app transaction, electronic wire and direct deposit sent to Vivian, Desmond, and Trayvon, since my brother had graduated college. The numbers populated on my left monitor, forming a neat, undeniable spreadsheet of systematic exploitation. First, there was the $30,000 I wired my father 2 years ago. He had called me in a panic, claiming the megachurch community outreach program was facing a massive deficit due to unexpected neighborhood demands. He swore that if he could not cover the shortfall, it would destroy his standing with the executive board and ruin his pristine reputation in the Atlanta religious community. Then there was the $50,000 I gave Trayvon to seed his very first tech startup, a supposedly revolutionary app that never materialized past a flashy launch party at a downtown club. I found the $25,000 emergency medical loan my mother requested for her specialized back treatments, a sudden health crisis, which conveniently coincided perfectly with a luxurious 2-week vacation she and my father took to the Amalfi Coast. The spreadsheet rows multiplied rapidly as I filtered the data by recipient. $10,000 here for Trayvon to cover emergency car repairs on a luxury vehicle he could not actually afford. $8,000 there for a designer wardrobe update. Trayvon claimed he absolutely needed to look the part for elite investor pitches. $5,000 to cover my parents' country club dues. They swore they had just forgotten to pay due to clerical banking errors. I documented every single transaction, creating a flawless timeline of their financial dependency. The sheer volume of entitlement was staggering. Every time they had needed a quick fix to maintain their opulent facade, I was the one who quietly footed the bill. The realization settled over me, not as grief, but as a profound, chilling clarity. They had treated me as nothing more than a highly efficient, endlessly accessible corporate funding source entirely devoid of any genuine emotional connection. The total sum was staggering, easily clearing $250,000 in direct, untraceable cash transfers alone. But I had authorized those. I had been foolish, blinded by a lingering sense of familial duty and the desperate hope of finally earning their basic respect. But I had clicked send. That was legally on me. I took a sharp, steadying breath, compartmentalizing the profound frustration. The cash transfers were gone, permanently written off as bad personal debts. I shifted my focus to my primary credit profiles. If I was going to completely cut them off, I needed to run a comprehensive hard pull across all 3 major credit bureaus. I had to make absolutely certain there were no lingering auto-pay subscriptions, hidden accounts, or shared financial liabilities tying my pristine financial identity to their chaotic, debt-fueled lives. The comprehensive credit report compiled quickly on my center monitor. My score was impeccable, a direct testament to my strict financial discipline and years of careful planning. I scrolled smoothly past my primary mortgage, my luxury car lease, and my standard corporate expense accounts. Everything looked perfectly aligned until my eyes caught a peculiar, glaring line item buried deep in the revolving credit section. It was a secondary platinum credit tier account, securely attached to my primary banking profile. My brow furrowed in immediate confusion. I exclusively used one platinum card for major travel and corporate expenses, but this specific listing showed a secondary authorized user account, issued exactly 4 months ago. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes tracking the raw data points. The registered billing address was not my downtown condo. It was routed to a private post office box in the wealthy district of Buckhead. I quickly cross-referenced the zip code with my internal personal files. It was the exact same zip code where Trayvon recently claimed to have leased a stunning new luxury apartment. A cold, sharp sensation prickled at the base of my neck. I opened my secure banking portal and bypassed the basic consumer dashboard, utilizing my professional credentials to access the raw transaction data logs directly from the banking server. I isolated the secondary platinum card and requested a full itemized statement history dating back to the exact moment of issuance. I sat back and waited for the system to process the massive data request, the silence of my apartment suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. The financial data populated instantly across my right screen. I stared at the numbers, the breath completely leaving my lungs in a sudden rush. The current outstanding balance on the secondary platinum card sat at a terrifying $198,742. It was maxed out to the absolute limit. I did not panic. I did not scream. I simply hit export, converting the raw data into an analytical spreadsheet, and began examining the charges line by line. The financial anatomy of Chantel and Trevon's fake high society wedding unfolded before my eyes in glaring, undeniable detail. Exactly 4 months ago, an initial charge of $15,000 was processed to an elite bridal boutique in downtown Atlanta. 2 months later, $45,000 was paid directly to a high-end event catering service specifically known for servicing celebrity galas and elite political fundraisers. There was a separate $30,000 charge to a highly exclusive boutique public relations firm. They had likely been hired to ensure the wedding photos appeared in prominent local society blogs to artificially manufacture their wealthy influencer aesthetic. Then came the final devastating blow. A single massive transaction processed just 5 days ago for $85,000, paid directly to an exclusive yacht chartering company based out of Miami but operating a luxury vessel on a nearby private lake. The remaining $23,000 were a chaotic, rapid-fire mix of designer clothing purchases, first-class flights securely booked for a future date to Paris, and massive bar tabs at VIP lounges across the city. The audacity of their spending was almost clinical in its precision. They had mapped out the ultimate elite experience, sparing absolutely no expense, secure in the knowledge that the bill would ultimately fall on my shoulders. Every single extravagant, performative detail of the wedding I had just been brutally mocked at was paid for by my pristine credit score. They had literally financed their arrogant exclusion of me using my own money. I sat in the quiet glow of my monitors, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. It was brilliant in its cruelty. They knew my corporate lifestyle meant I rarely scrutinized the physical mail, and routing the physical card to a Buckhead postbox ensured I never saw a paper statement. They had weaponized my busy career against me to fund their social climbing fantasies. But the most chilling aspect of the entire scheme was not the staggering volume of the theft. It was the precise legal mechanics required to execute it. I pulled up the digital authorization forms tied to the card issuance directly from the bank database. To open a secondary platinum line with a $200,000 limit, the bank required rigid dual authentication and physical signature verification. I opened the highly encrypted scanned PDF of the original credit application. I zoomed in on the bottom right corner of the document. There, glaring back at me in high definition, was a flawless, meticulously practiced forgery of my signature. My own family had studied my handwriting to perfection. Trevon and Chantel did not just take my $15,000. They forged my signature to underwrite their entire fake Black excellence wedding. Most victims of identity theft would immediately panic, pick up their phones, and dial the standard customer service number printed on the back of their credit card. They would spend hours crying to a low-level representative, begging for a freeze, and waiting weeks for a corporate fraud department to conduct a sluggish bureaucratic investigation. But I was not a standard victim, and I certainly was not going to leave the fate of my financial identity in the hands of a retail banking call center. I am a senior forensic auditor who routinely dismantles multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement rings before my morning espresso. I did not want to just cancel the card. I wanted absolute, unquestionable proof, and I wanted to secure the raw data before anyone realized I was inside the system. I leaned forward in my ergonomic office chair, the soft blue light from my 3 massive monitors reflecting off the glass surface of my desk. I bypassed the standard consumer banking portal entirely. Instead, I initiated a secure, highly encrypted virtual private network tunnel directly into my firm's proprietary auditing servers. From there, I utilized a back-end corporate gateway that granted me read-only access to the banking conglomerate's raw merchant processing data. It was a gray area of professional access, but considering my own name was forged on the documents, I considered it a necessary audit. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the dead silence of my downtown condo. I isolated the exact moment the secondary platinum account was opened 4 months ago. I did not just want the application file, I wanted the entire digital footprint. Every single transaction processed on the internet leaves a trail of breadcrumbs, a permanent digital residue that careless people never think to cover up. I extracted the metadata embedded in the original credit application. I pulled the exact Internet Protocol addresses, the timestamps, and the device identification tags associated with the digital signature logs. The results populated on my center monitor, confirming my darkest suspicions with clinical precision. The application was not submitted from a random coffee shop or a public Wi-Fi network. The IP address resolved directly to the high-speed internet provider servicing the exact luxury Buckhead apartment complex Trayvon had recently moved into. But the data went even deeper than that. The specific hardware identifier, the media access control address, attached to the device used to forge my name, did not belong to my brother's laptop. The device logs positively identified an absolutely brand new top-tier mobile smartphone. It was the exact same highly recognizable rose gold device Chantel had been ostentatiously tapping on the dining room table all evening. Chantel had personally executed the forgery. She had sat in the comfort of a luxury apartment that I was likely subsidizing, held her rose gold phone, and carefully traced my signature onto a digital banking contract to steal $200,000 from me. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to remain steady. Anger was a useless emotion right now. Anger makes you sloppy. Calculation makes you dangerous. I needed to see exactly how they managed to convince high-end luxury vendors to charge a massive wedding to a third-party credit card without raising any immediate red flags. High society wedding planners and elite event coordinators usually required rigorous identity verification to prevent chargebacks on six-figure events. I needed the communication logs. I shifted my focus to my right monitor and ran a deep web search on the boutique public relations firm and the luxury event planning agency listed in the credit card transactions. Using open-source intelligence gathering tools and a few advanced database queries I typically reserved for corporate espionage cases, I mapped out the digital infrastructure of the wedding planner's business. They were using a popular but notoriously unsecured third-party invoicing and client communication portal. It took me less than 12 minutes to bypass their weak administrative firewall and gain full access to the back-end communication logs. I downloaded the entire master folder labeled The Ultimate Black Excellence Wedding. I opened the primary email thread, my eyes scanning the hundreds of messages exchanged between the wedding planner Trayvon and Chantel over the last 4 months. I read through the arrogant demands for imported white orchids, the custom monogrammed silk napkins, the drone photography teams, and the private chef tasting menus. It was a sickening display of unearned entitlement. Then I found the exact exchange I was looking for. 2 weeks before the wedding, the lead event planner had sent an urgent email to Chantel. The planner noted that the primary name on the Platinum credit card being used to fund the yacht charter and the catering did not match the names of the bride or groom. The planner politely requested a formal authorization form and a photocopy of the cardholder's identification to comply with their fraud prevention policies. Chantel's response, sent just 20 minutes later, was documented in cold, undeniable text. "Do not worry about the primary account holder," Chantel wrote. "That is just Trayvon's older sister. She is a stiff, boring corporate drone who practically lives in a cubicle. She is our clueless cash cow. We handle all her personal finances because she is simply too busy and too socially inept to care about luxury events. Just send me the authorization form and I will have her sign it tonight. Run the card for the full $85,000 for the yacht. She will not even notice the charge until next year." Trayvon had been copied on the email. His only response was a crying laughing emoji and a brief message saying, "Make sure you charge the premium open bar package to her card too. She owes us for being so embarrassing at Thanksgiving." I stopped reading. The sheer depth of the malice radiated from the screen, chilling me to the bone. They did not just opportunistically use my credit in a moment of desperation. They actively, aggressively despised me. They sat at family dinners, accepted my cash loans, and smiled in my face while secretly mocking my work ethic. They viewed my financial discipline not as a virtue, but as a pathetic weakness to be ruthlessly exploited for their own luxury. They had constructed this massive, life-ruining financial anchor around my neck, fully intending to let me drown in the debt, while they posted heavily filtered photos of their fake wealth on social media. A lesser woman might have broken down. A lesser woman might have driven straight back to that sprawling estate and screamed until her lungs gave out. But as I sat there in the glow of the monitors, I felt an absolute terrifying calm wash over me. I was no longer dealing with family. I was dealing with hostile corporate parasites, and I knew exactly how to eradicate a parasite. I pushed the emails aside and pivoted my attention to the other side of the master billing ledger. According to the event planner's meticulously detailed spreadsheet, the entire wedding cost roughly $250,000. I had unknowingly funded $200,000 of it through the forged credit line. But there was a remaining balance of $50,000 for the boutique catering the string quartet and the designer floral arrangements. According to the email threads, Chantel had proudly declared that her incredibly wealthy parents would be covering those specific invoices to maintain their high society standing. I opened the payment processing logs to trace those specific deposits. If Chantel's family was truly the Atlanta elite she constantly bragged about, the routing numbers on their wire transfers should trace back to a high net worth wealth management firm, a private offshore banking institution, or at the absolute very least, a top-tier national bank. Generational wealth leaves a very specific, undeniable financial footprint. I pulled the clearinghouse data for the 2 wire transfers sent by Chantel's mother to the wedding planner. I stared at the 9-digit American Bankers Association routing transit number on the screen. Something was immediately glaringly wrong. The number did not align with any major financial institution I recognized. I cross-referenced the routing code through the Federal Banking Registry database. The results loaded instantly, and a cold, sharp smile finally broke across my face. The funds did not originate from a prestigious wealth management portfolio. The routing number belonged to a tiny regional credit union based out of a strip mall in a low-income county. It was an institution notoriously known for issuing high-interest subprime payday loans and title loans to desperate consumers. It was the exact kind of predatory lending bank you only used when traditional financial institutions flatly refused to look at your ruined credit score. A family with true old money, a family of prominent socialites, would never under any circumstances possess a primary checking account at a subprime payday loan center. The entire foundation of Chantel's arrogant, elitist persona was a massive, carefully constructed lie. If her parents were actually broke and relying on predatory loans to fund a fraction of a wedding, then this entire aesthetic was a house of cards. They were broke grifters using each other for clout and using my stolen credit to fund their shared illusion. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with before I dismantled their lives. I opened a fresh, fully encrypted terminal window, bypassed the standard public records searches, and decided to run a full, unrestricted forensic background check on my brand new sister-in-law. I typed Chantel's full legal name into my firm's proprietary background screening database. I needed to peel back the heavy layers of Instagram filters and high society posturing to expose the actual financial architecture of her life. I started with her parents. Chantel had spent the last 2 years casually name-dropping her father's supposed real estate empire and her mother's philanthropic galas. At Sunday dinners, my parents would listen with rapt attention, practically salivating over the elite connections they believed they were absorbing by association. I ran their social security numbers through the federal tax registry. The results populated on my left monitor in stark, unforgiving black and white text. There was no real estate empire. There were no philanthropic galas. Instead, I found a horrific, undeniable trail of total financial ruin. The screen lit up with active federal tax liens totaling over $400,000. The IRS had been aggressively garnishing what little income they had managed to scrape together for the past 3 years. I pulled their property records. The supposed sprawling family estate they bragged about was actually a heavily mortgaged mid-sized home that was currently in active pre-foreclosure. The bank was literally weeks away from seizing the property and putting padlocks on the doors. Just 2 months ago, they had filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy in a desperate, frantic bid to delay the inevitable. These were not elite generational wealth socialites. They were drowning in insurmountable debt, frantically treading water while pretending to own the ocean. Next, I turned my attention to Chantel herself. I opened a separate browser window and pulled up her public social media accounts, cross-referencing her flawless, curated aesthetic with her actual financial footprint. On Instagram, she was the picture of unbothered luxury. She posted daily photos posing with $30,000 Birkin bags, sipping expensive champagne in first-class cabins, and attending exclusive polo matches. She regularly hashtagged her posts with phrases about generational wealth and elite living. The financial reality running on my right monitor was pathetic. The designer bags were leased through a luxury rental subscription service billed monthly to a high-interest credit card. Those glamorous first-class cabin photos were taken at a well-known photography studio in downtown Atlanta that specifically rented out a fake Gulfstream airplane set by the hour for desperate influencers wanting to fake a jet-setting lifestyle. I traced her banking history and found 6 separate credit cards registered in her name. Every single one of them was pushed to the absolute maximum limit, bleeding with exorbitant interest rates and flagged for severe delinquency. She had not made a minimum payment in 4 months. Chantel was not a wealthy heiress. She was a broke, desperate grifter playing a high-stakes game of smoke and mirrors, desperately searching for a wealthy Mark to rescue her from her family's impending financial collapse. And she thought she had found that ultimate rescue in my brother. I shifted my focus to Trevon. He had spent the entire Sunday dinner boasting about his latest tech startup securing massive venture capital funding. He walked around the megachurch, shaking hands like a young, brilliant CEO, soaking in the admiration of the congregation. My parents paraded him around like a trophy, introducing him to local politicians and wealthy business owners. I opened the Georgia Secretary of State corporate registry and pulled the filings for his highly publicized tech company. The business was registered as a standard limited liability company. It had a sleek logo and a beautifully designed landing page full of corporate buzzwords. But when I ran the employer identification number through the commercial banking networks, I found a complete void. There was absolutely zero registered revenue. There were no active payroll accounts, no pending venture capital wires, and no legitimate business activity whatsoever. The corporate bank account attached to his supposedly booming tech empire had a current available balance of exactly $42.16. His entire career was a hollow shell, a registered name on a piece of paper designed solely to give him a prestigious title to flaunt at Sunday service. A dark, cynical laugh escaped my lips, breaking the heavy silence of my home office. It was a mutual scam. The sheer breathtaking absurdity of the situation was staggering. Chantel had targeted Trayvon, believing he was a wealthy, successful tech CEO who could elevate her social status and save her from bankruptcy. She thought she had secured a golden ticket to the Atlanta elite. Trayvon had targeted Chantel, believing she was an old-money socialite who could provide the perfect elite aesthetic to impress our parents and his imaginary investors. He thought he was marrying into a dynasty. They had essentially conned each other. 2 broke, desperate clout chasers locked in a marriage built entirely on mutual deception. When they inevitably realized neither of them actually had any money to fund the extravagant lifestyle they had promised each other, they panicked. They needed to maintain the illusion at all costs. They could not let my parents know Trayvon was a failure, and they could not let Chantel's followers know she was broke. So they turned to the only legitimate, verifiable source of wealth in their immediate circle: me. They forged my signature and stole my platinum credit line to fund the extravagant yacht wedding that validated their fake lives. They smiled in my face and called me a clueless cash cow while anchoring their massive toxic debt to my pristine financial identity. But the math still did not completely add up. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the interconnected web of lies mapped out across my monitors. If Trayvon's company generated zero revenue, how was he affording his daily life? The custom-tailored suits he wore to church, the luxury sports car he drove, the expensive dinners he hosted to impress Chantel's bankrupt parents. The answer hit me with a sickening wave of realization. Vivian and Desmond. My parents were secretly funding his lifestyle. They were pouring their own money into Trayvon's empty pockets to ensure he looked like the perfect successful son. My mother's obsession with projecting flawless black excellence at their mega church was so consuming that she was willing to subsidize my brother's fraudulent existence just to keep up appearances. They sat in the VIP circle at church, basking in the glory of their fake CEO son, terrified of the social embarrassment the truth would bring. They were actively enabling a fraud to protect their own fragile pride. They looked down on my legitimate, hard-earned corporate career because it was not glamorous enough for their elite social circle, yet they quietly, desperately financed Trayvon's glamorous lies. They excluded me from the wedding because my factual, realistic presence threatened the delicate fantasy world they had all built together. I sat there, the blue light of the screens reflecting in my eyes, feeling absolutely nothing for these people anymore. My family was a hollow shell of performative wealth entirely dependent on my silence and my bank account to survive. But my forensic mind caught on a single glaring discrepancy. A loose thread that threatened to unravel an even darker, much more dangerous secret: the luxury penthouse in Buckhead. I knew the exact residential building Trayvon had just moved into. It was an ultra-exclusive, high-security high-rise reserved for professional athletes, top-tier corporate executives, and legitimate millionaires. The building featured private elevator access, a rooftop infinity pool, and a dedicated concierge service. The absolute cheapest unit in that building leased for $12,000 a month. Corporate management companies handling properties of that caliber do not accept fake Instagram followers or empty LLC documents as proof of income. They operate with ruthless financial scrutiny. They require rigorous background checks, verified tax returns, proof of liquid assets, and massive security deposits. If Trayvon had zero corporate revenue and Chantel was dodging collection agencies and my stolen credit card was already maxed out on their fake wedding, how in the world did they pass the financial screening to secure that penthouse lease? It was physically impossible for either of them to be approved. Trayvon's bank account held less than $50. Chantel's credit score was a glowing red hazard sign. Even with my parents subsidizing Trayvon's suits and car payments, Vivian and Desmond did not have the liquid capital to casually drop $12,000 a month on a secondary residence without triggering massive flags in their own finances. There was another piece to this puzzle: a massive influx of collateral that I had not yet uncovered. Someone with impeccable credit and substantial verified assets had to have signed the guarantor documents to bypass the property management's financial security checks. My fingers moved back to the keyboard, my eyes narrowing with intense predatory focus. I needed to see the exact lease agreement. I bypassed the standard public property searches. I opened a secure backdoor channel and hacked directly into the commercial real estate registry for that specific Buckhead high-rise. The system prompted me for clearance, and I utilized a set of elite corporate auditing credentials to force my way past the firewall. I was going to find out exactly whose name was legally anchoring that $12,000 a month penthouse. The high-security servers of the Buckhead property management conglomerate were surprisingly easy to breach if you knew exactly where the administrative vulnerabilities were hidden. I did not need to hack into their main consumer-facing website. I went straight for the third-party commercial vetting software they use to screen high-net-worth tenants. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, ruthless precision. I inputted my elite corporate auditing credentials, bypassing the initial firewall, and slipped directly into their private document repository. I isolated the property address for the luxury high-rise and filtered the active tenant list by Trayvon's last name. The system lagged for a fraction of a second before retrieving a massive, highly encrypted PDF file containing a 70-page lease agreement and all its accompanying financial disclosures. I downloaded the file, dragged it onto my center monitor, and began dissecting the documentation that allowed my unemployed brother to live like a king. The lease was for the penthouse suite on the 42nd floor, an opulent, sprawling unit boasting panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, private elevator access, and a dedicated concierge. The base rent was exactly $12,500 a month. With luxury building fees, reserved parking for 2 vehicles, and premium utilities, the monthly liability pushed past $14,000. Trayvon had signed a standard 12-month lease, legally committing to a staggering $168,000 in rent alone. I scrolled down to the income verification section, fully expecting to see a fabricated document, but the sheer arrogance of what Trayvon had submitted made me let out a sharp, incredulous breath. He had provided a forged employment verification letter, listing himself as the chief executive officer of his shell company, claiming an annual base salary of $350,000. He had even submitted doctored bank statements, likely using basic photo editing software, to add extra zeros to his pathetic checking account balance. But property management companies handling luxury real estate do not simply take a flashy title and a printed piece of paper at face value. They run deep, comprehensive background checks. They require verified liquid assets, and when a young, unproven tenant with a questionable credit history tries to secure a penthouse, they demand an ironclad guarantor, someone whose verified wealth can legally cover the entire lease if the primary tenant defaults. I bypassed the standard lease terms and jumped straight to the final 20 pages of the document, the guarantor addendum. I needed to see exactly who was subsidizing this delusion. The digital signatures at the bottom of the page were verified, time-stamped, and legally binding. Desmond and Vivian. My parents had co-signed the lease. They had legally anchored themselves to Trayvon's massive financial liability. I leaned back in my chair, staring at their signatures. It did not make logical sense. I knew my parents' financial situation intimately. While they projected an image of immense wealth at their megachurch, their actual liquid capital was entirely tied up in their suburban estate and their performative charitable donations. They drove leased luxury cars and wore designer clothes, but they lived month to month, highly dependent on Desmond's church salary and Vivian's occasional real estate commissions. They absolutely did not possess the required liquid assets to qualify as guarantors for a $168,000 lease liability. The property management company would have rejected their application outright unless they had pledged something massive, something completely unencumbered by debt, as direct collateral. I highlighted the collateral verification section of the guarantor agreement and expanded the text. The property management company required the guarantors to list a verified, highly liquid financial asset that could be legally seized in the event of an eviction or default. My eyes tracked across the screen, scanning the account routing numbers and the institutional banking codes listed by my parents. The blood instantly drained from my face and a heavy, suffocating silence descended over my home office. The account number listed as collateral was not a standard checking or savings account. It was the routing number for a highly restricted, high-yield, irrevocable trust fund managed by an elite private wealth firm. I did not need to run a secondary search to identify who owned that specific account. I knew the exact balance to the penny. I knew the routing number by heart. It was my emergency trust fund. 5 years ago, my father had suffered a mild heart attack. The medical scare had sent a shockwave of panic through our family. Realizing that my parents had spent their entire lives prioritizing their social image over basic retirement planning, I had quietly taken it upon myself to ensure they would never face poverty in their old age. I had taken $300,000 of my own hard-earned corporate bonuses money I had sacrificed nights, weekends, and holidays to earn and locked it into a high-yield trust. I made myself the sole primary trustee. I established rigid legal parameters dictating that the funds could only be accessed for catastrophic medical emergencies or late-stage retirement care for Vivian and Desmond. It was the ultimate act of silent, thankless daughterly love. I had built a financial fortress to protect the very people who constantly told me I was not good enough. And now, staring at the glowing screen, I saw exactly how they had repaid that loyalty. To use an irrevocable trust as collateral for a commercial real estate lease, the property management company requires explicit notarized authorization from the primary trustee. My parents could not simply list the account number. They had to provide legal proof that I had willingly pledged my $300,000 safety net to secure Trayvon's luxury apartment. I opened the final attachment in the PDF file. It was a notarized letter of authorization, supposedly drafted and signed by me. It stated that I, as the primary trustee, fully authorized the property management company to seize up to $168,000 directly from the trust if Trayvon or my parents failed to pay the rent. At the bottom of the page was my forged signature identical to the one on the stolen platinum credit card, right next to a fraudulent notary stamp. The ultimate betrayal settled into my bones, cold and absolute. This was no longer just about golden child favoritism or toxic family dynamics. This was calculated felony financial violence. My own parents, the esteemed untouchable pillars of their elite Atlanta megachurch, the people who stood at the pulpit every Sunday and preached about integrity, honesty, and black excellence, had knowingly committed severe wire fraud and identity theft against their own daughter. They had looked at the $300,000 I had bled to save for their future medical care, and they had decided that Trayvon's fake CEO image was more important. They risked my entire financial stability, my legal standing, and my hard-earned wealth, all to ensure their grifter son could impress a bankrupt fake socialite from Instagram. They were willing to let my emergency trust fund be completely drained by corporate landlords just so Trayvon could throw VIP parties on a rooftop in Buckhead. I thought back to the dinner table just hours ago. I remembered my mother casually sipping her imported wine, looking down her nose at me and calling me stiff corporate and calculating about money. She had accused me of lacking the proper high society aesthetic. She had told me I would have embarrassed Chantel's wealthy parents. She sat there draped in the armor of a devoted, holy matriarch, fully knowing she had forged my signature to risk my entire life savings. My father had sat there silently eating his prime rib, playing the role of the dignified patriarch, fully complicit in the complete destruction of my financial safety net. They did not just exclude me from a yacht wedding, they actively maliciously sold me out to fund the very illusion that kept me excluded. They despised me, but they felt entirely entitled to my wealth. I was not a daughter to them. I was collateral damage in their desperate, pathetic war for social validation. A terrifying, serene clarity washed away any lingering shock or disbelief. The familial bond, whatever frayed, pathetic remnants of it, had survived. The dinner completely evaporated. There would be no tearful phone calls demanding an explanation. There would be no dramatic, screaming confrontations at the family estate. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of painting me as the angry, jealous, unstable sister. I was not going to allow my mother to play the victim and turn her church congregation against me with lies about my lack of family loyalty. They wanted to play high-stakes corporate games. They wanted to forge legal documents, steal credit lines, and leverage restricted trusts. They had invited a senior forensic auditor into a financial war, completely underestimating the monster they had just unleashed. I closed the PDF files and opened a fresh encrypted terminal on my center monitor. The gloves were officially off. I was going to dismantle their perfectly curated lives, their fake wealth, and their untouchable mega-church reputation piece by piece. I would not use emotion. I would use the cold, unforgiving hammer of corporate law. I began mapping out the exact sequence of legal and financial traps I was about to spring, starting with the property management company that currently held the fraudulent lease to Trayvon's penthouse. The morning sun began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo, casting long, sharp shadows across my glass desk. I had not slept a single minute yet. My mind was operating with a terrifying, hyper-focused clarity. I sat completely still, staring at the digital signatures of my parents on the guarantor documents. Vivian and Desmond had essentially signed away my entire future to subsidize Trayvon's temporary illusion of wealth. Standard protocol for any victim of identity theft and financial fraud would be to immediately contact the banking authorities, freeze all affected accounts, and initiate a massive police investigation. I could easily dial the fraud department, flag the secondary platinum card, and report the forged lease to the authorities. That action would instantly sever my financial liability and trigger a chaotic wave of automated alerts to Trevon and Chantel. They would panic, my parents would scramble to hire defense attorneys, and Vivian would undoubtedly spin a masterful, tearful narrative to her mega-church congregation about a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by her vindictive corporate daughter. A standard cancellation would allow them to scatter. It would give them room to maneuver to play the victim and to escape the absolute crushing weight of what they had done. I refused to let that happen. I did not want to merely cancel the card or void the lease. I wanted total suffocating control over their entire reality. I wanted to hold the keys to their fake kingdom before I burned it to the ground. I closed the PDF containing my forged signature and shifted my attention to the corporate ownership structure of the Buckhead penthouse. The property management company listed on the lease was a subsidiary of Vanguard Horizon Properties. I read the name on my screen, and a tight, humorless smile touched my lips. Vanguard Horizon was a massive commercial real estate conglomerate that dominated the luxury residential market across the southeastern United States. More importantly, they were an entity I knew intimately. Just 2 years ago, Vanguard Horizon had faced a catastrophic, highly sensitive federal audit. A rogue regional director had been aggressively cooking the books, hiding millions of dollars in toxic liabilities and fraudulent vendor contracts across several of their flagship luxury developments. The federal regulators had been circling, preparing to gut the entire conglomerate with fines that would have triggered an immediate corporate bankruptcy. My forensic accounting firm had been quietly retained to excise the rot before the federal hammers fell. I was the lead auditor assigned to that specific high-stakes case. I personally spent 4 grueling months untangling their corrupted financial web, restructuring their regional debt, and shielding Vanguard from total public annihilation. On the final day of the audit, their chief operating officer, a ruthless old-school corporate titan named Marcus Sterling, had shaken my hand in a heavily secured, soundproofed boardroom. He looked me dead in the eye and explicitly stated that he owed me a blood debt for saving his empire. In the elite tiers of corporate finance, a blood debt is not a casual pleasantry. It is a blank check waiting to be cashed. It was time to collect. I glanced at the digital clock on my monitor. It was exactly 7 in the morning. Marcus was notorious in the industry for being at his desk by 6 every single day. I picked up my encrypted mobile phone, bypassed his executive assistants, using the private direct line he had given me, and waited as it rang. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice crisp, deep, and fiercely professional. When I identified myself, his tone shifted instantly, adopting a layer of deep, respectful caution. People in our specialized industry do not call in favors casually, and they certainly do not call at dawn unless the ground is shifting beneath their feet. I did not waste his time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I needed a highly specific, strictly confidential transaction executed immediately regarding one of his residential properties in Buckhead. I kept the explanation clinical and entirely devoid of emotion. I informed Marcus that a newly signed lease in his flagship luxury building had been fraudulently secured using my personal, irrevocable trust fund as unauthorized collateral. I explained that the primary tenants were engaged in active financial fraud, utilizing forged documentation to bypass his property management screening protocols. Marcus was silent for a long moment, processing the severe legal liability his firm now faced by holding a fraudulent contract tied to my name. He immediately apologized for the oversight and offered to dispatch his corporate legal team to void the lease and have the tenants physically evicted by noon. He promised to erase the contract from their systems as if it never existed, but I stopped him. I told Marcus that an eviction was entirely too simple. An eviction was a mere slap on the wrist that would send them packing to another luxury building to run the exact same scam. I did not want Vanguard to void the lease. I wanted to purchase the liability outright. I instructed Marcus that I wanted my private anonymous holding company to quietly buy out the management rights and the specific debt portfolio attached to Trayvon's lease. I wanted Vanguard to legally assign the entirety of that 12-month, $168,000 contract directly to my corporate entity. I offered to pay a premium to acquire the debt, assuming full administrative and legal control of the unit's lease. I wanted to become the exclusive holder of the paper. Marcus hesitated, the silence stretching across the line. He noted that buying out a single residential leasehold debt was an incredibly unusual request, a maneuver typically reserved for massive commercial acquisitions, not individual apartment units. I did not argue. I simply reminded him of the $90 million in federal penalties and the catastrophic public relations nightmare I had shielded his firm from during the audit. I gently suggested that executing this transfer was the exact price of balancing his ledger with me. The hesitation vanished instantly. Corporate titans understand leverage better than anyone. He told me he would have his general counsel draft the assignment documents and non-disclosure agreements within the hour. I hung up the phone and opened my corporate registry portal. I quickly activated a dormant limited liability company I kept on retainer for private investments. I named it Obsidian Holdings, LLC, ensuring my personal name was buried beneath layers of registered agent protections. No one searching the public tax records would ever be able to trace Obsidian Holdings back to my primary downtown address. Exactly 47 minutes later, the digital paperwork arrived in my secure encrypted inbox. Vanguard Horizon was executing a silent, immediate transfer of all leaseholder rights for Penthouse 42A. To Trayvon Chantel and my enabling parents, absolutely nothing would change on the surface. Trayvon would still swipe his key fob in the lobby, ride the private elevator to the top floor, and post arrogant videos from the rooftop infinity pool. He would still believe he was untouchable. But legally, Vanguard was no longer their landlord. Obsidian Holdings was. I meticulously reviewed the assignment contract line by line. The legal verbiage transferred all enforcement rights, eviction authority, default penalties, and debt collection powers directly to my corporate entity. It also explicitly transferred the legal claim to the collateral. If the lease defaulted, Obsidian Holdings held the exclusive right to execute the seizure of the guarantor assets. I was effectively taking control of the very trap my parents had set for me. I routed the purchase funds through an untraceable corporate clearing account, digitally signed the transfer documents with my verified security token, and wired the payment directly to Vanguard's escrow account. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the processing screen load. A green confirmation banner illuminated my center monitor. The transaction was complete. The digital ink was dry, binding them to me in a web of corporate law that they could not charm or pray their way out of. The sheer magnitude of the power shift settled over me. Trayvon and Chantel were currently sleeping in a custom California king bed they could not actually afford inside a sprawling penthouse they had fraudulently secured, completely unaware that the concrete floor beneath them had just evaporated. My parents had illegally leveraged my entire future to give their golden grifter son a kingdom, and I had just bought the kingdom out from under them. I was no longer merely a victim of a forged lease or a stolen credit card. I was legally Trayvon and Chantel's landlord. I held the absolute primary debt on their entire fraudulent existence. If they missed a rent payment by a single hour, if they violated a single clause in that 70-page contract, I had the unilateral legal authority to lock them out, seize their assets, and publicly ruin them without relying on a third-party property manager to take action. I held their shelter, their fake clout, and their financial future in the palm of my hand. The real estate trap was perfectly set and fully armed. Now I needed to pivot my attention to the other half of their financial destruction. The secondary platinum credit card that Chantel was currently using to fund her extravagant, fake high society life. I could not simply let her continue racking up charges, but freezing the account abruptly would alert her too soon. I needed to let her keep spending, let her keep believing she had an endless supply of my money while I systematically dismantled her safety nets. I reached for my coffee, taking a slow sip as I pulled up the banking portal. It was time to audit the wedding vendors and ensure Chantel's fake elite lifestyle became a permanent, inescapable prison. I closed the Vanguard Horizon real estate portal and opened the direct encrypted interface for the banking conglomerate that issued the secondary platinum card. Standard operating procedure for consumer fraud dictates that the bank conducts a 30-day review temporarily crediting the account while investigators send polite letters to the merchants. That bureaucratic timeline was unacceptable. I needed immediate catastrophic financial trauma. I utilized my corporate credentials to bypass the consumer queue and patched directly into the bank's elite Tier 1 fraud division. This department handled massive corporate embezzlement and syndicated identity theft. I did not speak to a customer service representative. I routed my call directly to a senior fraud investigator I had previously collaborated with during a federal money laundering audit 2 years ago. I explained the situation with clinical, dispassionate precision. I transmitted the data packet I had compiled, the Buckhead IP addresses, the device identification tags from Chantel's rose gold smartphone, the metadata proving the signature was rendered digitally, and the undeniable fact that the secondary user had actively forged my authorization. I formally invoked the federal statutes for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Because the fraudulent transactions exceeded $100,000 and involved interstate commerce, specifically the Miami-based luxury yacht charter, the bank was legally obligated to file a suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The investigator on the line fell silent as he reviewed the raw data logs I had just securely transferred to his terminal. The evidence was absolute. There was no gray area, no room for a misunderstanding, and no possibility of a clerical error. I gave the verbal authorization, and the investigator struck the kill switch. The $200,000 credit line was not merely paused or suspended, it was violently, permanently frozen. The bank's security algorithms instantly locked the account, blacklisted the card numbers across all global merchant networks, and flagged Chantel's name in the International Fraud Registry. But freezing the account was only the first half of the execution. I instructed the investigator to initiate immediate hard chargebacks on every single transaction processed within the last 60 days. I formally disputed the $85,000 yacht charter, the $45,000 celebrity catering bill, and the $30,000 public relations retainer. I flagged every designer clothing purchase, every first-class flight to Paris, and every VIP lounge bar tab as unauthorized fraudulent theft. The banking system's automated clearinghouse operates with ruthless efficiency. Within seconds of my directive, the bank began electronically clawing back the funds directly from the merchants' commercial accounts. The money I had unknowingly paid to the elite wedding vendors was suddenly and forcefully ripped right back out of their hands. I thanked the investigator, terminated the call, and pulled up my live transaction monitoring dashboard. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, leaned back in my chair, and waited for the digital shockwaves to hit the physical world. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 11:14 in the morning, a live authorization request flashed across my right monitor in bright yellow text. Location: an ultra-exclusive appointment-only designer boutique in Phipps Plaza, the epicenter of luxury shopping in Atlanta. Amount $14,850. Merchant category: high-end apparel and leather goods. Chantel was shopping for her Paris honeymoon. I could picture the scene with absolute clarity. She was likely lounging on a plush velvet sofa in a private VIP fitting room, sipping complimentary sparkling water, while eager sales associates wrapped up thousands of dollars worth of silk resort wear, designer luggage, and excessive accessories. She was playing the role of the exhausted wealthy newlywed, preparing for her European getaway. Traven was probably standing beside her, adjusting his custom suit, acting like the bored tech billionaire indulging his beautiful wife. They had likely handed my stolen platinum card to the boutique manager with an arrogant flick of the wrist. I watched the screen as the banking server processed the request. It took less than 2 seconds. The yellow text flashed violently to crimson red. Status declined. Error code 04. Pickup card suspected fraud. Error code 04 is not a standard decline for insufficient funds. It is a hard, unyielding alert broadcast directly to the merchant. It legally instructs the cashier to physically confiscate the plastic card and immediately contact law enforcement because the person standing in front of them is holding stolen property. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, rich flavor. In that elite boutique, the sparkling water had suddenly turned to ash in Chantel's mouth. 10 seconds later, a second authorization request appeared on my screen. Amount $14,850. They were trying to run the card again. Chantel was undoubtedly pitching a fit, loudly insisting that the banking system was making a clerical error, demanding that the flustered sales associate try the chip reader one more time. She was likely throwing my name around, claiming her massive wealth was triggering a standard security hold. The crimson-red text flashed again. Status declined. Error code 04. 40 seconds later, a third attempt appeared. This time, the amount was modified. $5,000. Chantel was panicking. The illusion was cracking in front of the boutique manager, and she was desperately trying to split the transaction, hoping a smaller amount would slip past the security algorithms. Status declined. Error code 04. The public embarrassment would be absolute and immediate. The boutique manager, trained to handle high-net-worth clients, would suddenly realize they were dealing with common fraudsters. The polite smiles would vanish. The complimentary champagne would be cleared away. The towering pile of designer luggage would be swiftly moved back behind the register. Chantel and Trevon would be politely but firmly asked to leave the premises before mall security was summoned. They would have to walk out of that VIP fitting room empty-handed, passing by the staring eyes of other wealthy patrons, their fake socialite status entirely obliterated in the span of 3 minutes. My personal cell phone, resting on the glass desk beside my keyboard, suddenly lit up. The screen vibrated with an incoming text message from Trevon. "Hey Zuri, the bank is acting crazy and put a security hold on the corporate card. Chantel is at the mall trying to get her honeymoon bags. Can you call the fraud department and clear the hold? Tell them we are authorized. It is super embarrassing. Hurry up." The sheer breathtaking audacity of the text message was almost poetic. He had stolen my identity, forged my signature for $200,000, mocked me behind my back. And yet, he still had the arrogant nerve to demand that I call the bank to facilitate his theft, so his fake wife would not be embarrassed at the mall. He truly believed I was a blind, obedient corporate drone who existed solely to fund his lifestyle. I did not reply. I simply swiped the notification away and watched my monitors. The situation was about to escalate far beyond a declined shopping spree. The chargebacks I had initiated with the fraud department were currently hitting the accounting systems of the elite wedding vendors across the city. High-end caterers, luxury event planners, and exclusive public relations firms do not wait patiently when $50,000 payments are suddenly ripped from their merchant accounts. They operate on thin margins and demand immediate liquidity. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a rapid succession of panicked text messages from Trevon, his tone shifting from arrogant annoyance to absolute unadulterated terror. "Zuri, answer your phone right now. Zuri, what did you do to the card? Call me back immediately. The wedding planner just called me screaming. The payment for the yacht bounced back. They are threatening to call the police. Zuri, pick up the phone." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, reading the frantic messages as they flooded my screen. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had calculated. The luxury yacht charter company in Miami had just received an automated alert that their $85,000 invoice was flagged for active wire fraud. The celebrity caterer who had provided the lavish reception dinner had just discovered their $45,000 payment was reversed due to identity theft. The elite public relations firm that Chantel had hired to manufacture her fake socialite presence had just been notified that their $30,000 retainer was a stolen asset. These vendors were aggressive, highly connected business owners who did not tolerate theft. They had contracts, they had Trevon's fake CEO information, and they had Chantel's cell phone number. Right at this very moment, as Trevon and Chantel were being escorted out of a luxury boutique in complete disgrace, their phones were blowing up with hostile calls from furious vendors demanding their money. My phone began to ring. Trayvon's name flashed across the caller ID. I let it ring, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet clinical space of my home office. It rang until it went to voicemail. Instantly, an audio file appeared in my inbox. I clicked play, the speakers amplifying Trayvon's panicked, breathless voice. Zuri, you need to call the bank right now. I do not know what you told them, but the yacht company is threatening to file grand larceny charges against me. The caterer is saying they are going to sue. You cannot do this. Mom and Dad are going to be furious. You are ruining my life over a misunderstanding. Fix this right now. Call me. He was terrified, but he was still attempting to use our parents as a weapon, still trying to manipulate me with the threat of family disapproval. He had not yet realized that the family dynamic he was relying on had already been completely dismantled. He thought he was dealing with an angry sister who had simply canceled a credit card. He had no idea that he was actually dealing with the owner of Obsidian Holdings, the corporate landlord, who now held the exclusive lease to his penthouse, the primary debt holder who could render him homeless with a single legal filing. Panic had set in, but the true devastation had not even begun. I exported his voicemail and text messages, saving them directly into my encrypted forensic evidence file, alongside the Buckhead IP addresses and the forged signature logs. Every frantic demand, every admission of guilt was being carefully cataloged. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat. Vivian, Desmond, and Trayvon were all active, the typing indicators flashing rapidly as they likely scrambled to coordinate a damage control narrative. I needed to let them know that the days of my silent financial compliance were permanently over. I drafted a single, concise message completely devoid of emotion or familial warmth. The Platinum account has been permanently closed due to verified wire fraud and identity theft. All unauthorized transactions have been reversed. Federal authorities have been notified of the digital forgery originating from the Buckhead IP address. Do not contact me again regarding this matter. I hit send. I did not wait for the inevitable explosion of calls and text messages that would follow. I placed my phone on silent, turned it face down on the glass desk, and looked back at my monitors. The trap was sprung, the financial life support was severed, and the illusion was dead. Now it was time to initiate the formal eviction process for Penthouse 42A. The phone vibrated against the glass desk with the relentless, frantic energy of a dying insect. I left it face down. I stood up, walked away from my command center, and made my way to the kitchen. I needed a fresh espresso. The mechanical hum of the coffee machine was a soothing contrast to the digital bloodbath I had just orchestrated. I watched the dark, rich liquid pour into the ceramic cup, breathing in the bitter aroma. For the first time in my entire life, I felt no anxiety regarding my family. There was no racing heart, no desperate urge to placate them, no lingering guilt over failing to meet their impossible standards. There was only the cold, hard comfort of absolute leverage. I carried the espresso back to my office and sat down. I picked up my iPad, synced it to my primary communications array, and opened my call logs. The numbers were staggering, a testament to the sheer panic currently gripping their fake empire. Trayvon had called exactly 45 times in the span of 3 hours. When he realized I was not going to answer, he must have given my private cell phone number to his new wife, because Chantel had logged 30 back-to-back calls. Her attempts were frantic, clustering in tight 5-minute intervals. Finally, my parents had weighed in. Vivian and Desmond had called a combined 20 times, alternating between their individual devices and the main line at their suburban estate. 95 missed calls, 95 desperate attempts to regain control. I did not answer a single one. I went absolutely ghost. In the high-stakes world of corporate audits, silence is the most devastating weapon you can deploy against a fraudster. When you cut off communication, you deny them the ability to spin their narrative. You deny them the opportunity to gaslight, to negotiate, or to charm their way out of the consequences. By refusing to engage, I was locking them inside their own escalating terror. They had no idea what I had done, or where the next blow would come from. They only knew that the money was gone and the walls were closing in. I took a slow sip of my espresso and pulled up my secondary monitor. I logged into a dummy social media account I used for corporate background checks and navigated straight to Chantel's Instagram page. I wanted to see how the newly minted fake socialite was handling the sudden violent evaporation of her unlimited credit line. The contrast between her digital reality and her actual reality was a masterpiece of modern delusion. Chantel was actively taking to the internet to maintain the facade, fighting a losing war against the financial fires burning down her life behind the scenes. Her latest post, uploaded just 20 minutes after the luxury boutique had confiscated her card, was a heavily filtered, carefully cropped photo of a vintage Louis Vuitton luggage set. The caption read, "Packing for Paris. Honeymoon vibes with my amazing husband. Only the best for us." She had tagged a luxury travel concierge service and added a dozen champagne and airplane emojis. I scrolled down my iPad, pulling up the live fraud alerts directly adjacent to her social media feed. The reality was stark and unforgiving. The luxury travel concierge she had just tagged on Instagram was currently in the process of reversing the $20,000 first-class airline tickets because the merchant account had flagged the transaction as stolen. There would be no Paris honeymoon. There would be no first-class flights. The luggage she had posted was likely a stock photo pulled from a fashion blog, a desperate attempt to convince her followers that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. She posted a second update to her Instagram stories. It was a boomerang video of her holding a half-empty glass of sparkling water, the camera panning across a generic high-end hotel lobby. The text overlay read, "Exhausted from shopping but so blessed." I checked the timestamp. It was an old video. I recognized the lobby from a local Atlanta hotel where she had stayed during the wedding prep. She was recycling old content frantically, trying to project an image of unbothered luxury, while her phone was undoubtedly ringing with angry calls from unpaid vendors. She was sitting somewhere in Atlanta, entirely broke, furiously posting old videos to keep the illusion alive for an audience of strangers. The sheer pathology of it was fascinating to observe. She cared more about the perception of wealth than the terrifying reality of her impending criminal charges. I swiped away from Chantel's profile and opened my visual voicemail application. I had no intention of listening to their voices, but I needed to audit their messages for legal documentation. I clicked on the transcriptions for Vivian's voicemails. The evolution of my mother's tone over the course of 20 messages was a study in toxic entitlement. Her first few voicemails were dripping with condescension, treating the entire situation as an administrative error that I was simply too incompetent to fix. "Zuri, pick up the phone," the first transcription read. "Trayvon just called me in a panic. There is some ridiculous glitch with the bank holding up his honeymoon funds. Stop being dramatic and call whoever you need to call to clear the security hold. Your brother needs his honeymoon. Fix this glitch immediately." She genuinely believed she could just order me to reverse a federal fraud investigation. She thought a felony identity theft charge was a mere glitch that could be smoothed over because it inconvenienced her golden child. By the 10th voicemail, her tone had shifted from condescension to aggressive manipulation. "Zuri, this tantrum of yours is completely unacceptable," the text read on my screen. "You are embarrassing this family. Chantel is in tears. You are ruining their first week of marriage over a petty misunderstanding about a credit card. Your father and I expect you to act like an adult, turn the card back on, and apologize to your brother. Stop being so selfish." A petty misunderstanding. That was how the matriarch of an elite Atlanta megachurch described her son stealing $200,000 and forging a signature on a commercial lease. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. Every Sunday, Vivian stood before thousands of people preaching about integrity, accountability, and divine grace. Yet behind closed doors, she demanded that I act as a silent, compliant victim so her son could continue his fraudulent spending spree. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her name was digitally signed on the guarantor document sitting in my secure corporate vault. Her final voicemail, left just minutes ago, bordered on unhinged rage. "Zuri, if you do not answer this phone and fix this bank issue right now, you can forget about coming to the estate for the holidays. You can forget about being part of this family. You are cut off until you learn some respect. Call your brother and give him the account access, now. I deleted the transcriptions and forwarded the audio files to my encrypted server. Vivian's threat to cut me off was the ultimate irony. They had already excluded me from the yacht wedding, ignored my career, and treated me like a disposable bank account. Being cut off from their toxic, performative world was not a punishment. It was the exact liberation I had been working toward. I locked the iPad screen and set it aside. The credit card fraud was handled. The money had been clawed back. The federal authorities had their data, and the vendors were currently tearing Trayvon's fake CEO reputation to shreds. That particular fire would continue to burn on its own, consuming their social standing and their immediate cash flow. Now it was time to focus on the main event. It was time to shift my attention from the plastic in their wallets to the roof over their heads. I pulled up the corporate dashboard for Obsidian Holdings, LLC. The interface was minimalist, designed purely for high-level asset management. I clicked on the Active Portfolio tab and selected the single property currently registered to the entity. Penthouse 42A, Buckhead, Atlanta. I opened the master lease agreement. The 70-page document detailed every single restriction requirement and penalty associated with the sprawling luxury unit. Trayvon and Chantel had signed a standard 12-month commercial residential lease, legally binding themselves to a base rent of $12,500 per month, plus luxury amenities, parking, and premium utility fees. The total monthly liability hovered just over $14,000. When Vanguard Horizon originally processed the lease, they had set the billing cycle to the standard corporate schedule. I looked at the digital calendar displayed on the wall of my office. The days had blurred together during my forensic investigation, but the date was absolute. A slow, deeply satisfied calm washed over me as I registered the date on the calendar. The timing was a perfect, beautiful coincidence of corporate administration. The calendar had officially flipped. The month had turned. It was the first of the month. The rent for the Buckhead penthouse was officially due. Trayvon and Chantel were currently trapped in a spiral of credit card declines, fielding aggressive calls from wedding vendors and desperately trying to maintain their Instagram illusion. They had absolutely zero liquid capital. Trayvon's fake shell company had zero revenue. Chantel had zero assets. Their entire financial existence had been completely dependent on my stolen platinum card, which was now a dead piece of plastic. They had no money to pay the rent, and they had absolutely no idea that their new landlord was not a faceless property management conglomerate willing to offer a standard 5-day grace period. Their new landlord was Obsidian Holdings. Their new landlord was me. I opened the automated billing portal for Obsidian Holdings. With a few precise keystrokes, I generated the official monthly invoice for Penthouse 42A. I included the base rent, the concierge fees, the premium parking charges, and the mandatory building maintenance dues. The total amount due was exactly $14,250. I set the payment deadline to the strictest possible parameter allowed under Georgia commercial real estate law. Payment was due by close of business today. No grace period, no extensions, no leniency. I linked the invoice directly to the email addresses Trayvon and Chantel had provided on their original lease application. I also linked it to the secondary contact emails, the ones belonging to the legally binding guarantors, Vivian and Desmond. I hovered my mouse over the execution button. Once I clicked it, the automated system would blast the massive rent invoice to their phones, demanding immediate payment to a holding company they had never heard of. When that payment inevitably failed to materialize by 5 o'clock, it would trigger the exact legal mechanism I needed to initiate a catastrophic default. I clicked send, watching the notification flash across the screen, knowing that the real squeeze was about to begin. The delivery receipts registered on my dashboard almost instantaneously. 4 distinct green checkmarks illuminated the dark screen of my primary monitor, confirming that the Obsidian Holdings rent invoice had successfully landed in the inboxes of Trayvon, Chantel, Vivian, and Desmond. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the tracking analytics. The software I utilized for corporate collections provided real-time data on recipient engagement. Trevon opened the email first. The timestamp showed he opened it, closed it, and then opened it again 3 seconds later. He was likely staring at the $14,250 balance, trying to comprehend why a property management company he had never heard of was demanding immediate payment with zero grace period. 10 seconds later, Chantel opened her copy. 2 minutes after that, the tracking software indicated that both Vivian and Desmond had accessed the guarantor copies of the invoice. The digital silence in my office was profound, a sharp contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was erupting across the city. They were cornered. The frozen credit card meant they had no liquidity. The angry wedding vendors meant their social facade was burning. And the Obsidian Holdings invoice meant their physical sanctuary was under direct threat. I stood up from my desk, leaving the monitors glowing, and walked into my kitchen. I felt completely detached, operating with the cold mechanical efficiency of a senior auditor dismantling a corrupt shell company. I poured myself a tall glass of iced water and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there in the sprawling expanse of Buckhead, Trevon and Chantel were trapped in a penthouse that was rapidly transforming from a luxury suite into a legal cage. My personal cell phone had remained face down and silent for hours. I had blocked Trevon, Chantel, and my parents on every conceivable communication channel. My call logs showed a graveyard of rejected attempts. Trevon had tried another 45 times. Chantel had attempted 30 calls. Vivian and Desmond had dialed my number 20 times between them. They were collectively slamming into a digital brick wall, denied the one thing toxic families rely on to survive: the ability to control the narrative. I walked back into my home office and sat down just as a sharp, unfamiliar ringtone shattered the quiet. I glanced at the phone resting on the glass desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. It was not a registered contact. It was not a corporate line. It was a burner phone, or perhaps a prepaid device purchased from a convenience store. They had realized they were blocked and were now resorting to basic evasion tactics to breach my perimeter. I let it ring 3 times, analyzing the strategic value of answering. I did not want to negotiate, but I did want to verify the exact level of their desperation. I reached out, swiped the screen to accept the call, and brought the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. When the voice finally spoke, all the performative sweetness, all the high society affectation, and all the fake Instagram polish had been entirely stripped away. It was Chantel. She sounded breathless, enraged, and completely devoid of any self-awareness. She did not sound like a woman who had just been caught committing felony wire fraud. She sounded like an entitled customer filing a complaint with a subordinate. "The rent is overdue. Did you transfer the money yet? The building management is threatening to lock us out. Don't embarrass us." I sat perfectly still, processing the sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand. Chantel genuinely believed that I was still on the hook for their lifestyle. Even after the credit card was frozen, even after the wedding vendors had likely ripped into them, her first instinct was to call the victim of her financial crimes and demand that I pay the new landlord. She thought the Obsidian Holdings invoice was just another bill for me to handle. She had no idea she was speaking directly to the CEO of the company, threatening to throw her onto the street. Her command echoed in my ear. "Don't embarrass us." That was the core of her entire existence. The legal peril, the stolen identity, the forged guarantor documents, none of that mattered to Chantel. The only thing that mattered was the absolute terror of being exposed as a fraud in front of the Buckhead elite. She was terrified that the concierge downstairs would see her being escorted out by corporate security. She was terrified of the embarrassment. I let the silence stretch across the line, allowing her frantic energy to hit a solid wall of ice. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse. I spoke with the chilling clinical calmness of an auditor delivering a final verdict. "Didn't I tell you, just like your wedding, my money is only for special people?" I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button, cutting the connection before she could even draw a breath to respond. The click of the receiver was the most satisfying sound I had heard all week. I immediately blocked the burner number, ensuring she could not call back. I sat back and took a slow sip of my iced water, letting the weight of the interaction settle. Chantel was now spiraling. She had called her primary funding source, demanded money to stop an eviction, and was met with a cold, absolute rejection. She and Trayvon were sitting in that penthouse, staring at an unyielding deadline, possessing absolutely no means to satisfy the debt. But the true squeeze was not about Chantel and Trayvon. They were just the symptoms of the disease. The real disease was Vivian and Desmond. They were the ones who had enabled the fraud. They were the ones who had notarized a forged document leveraging my emergency trust fund. They had co-signed the commercial lease, legally anchoring their own financial future to Trayvon's fake empire. When the Obsidian Holdings invoice landed in their inboxes, they would have instantly recognized the legal peril. Vivian and Desmond lived month to month, maintaining an illusion of wealth funded by church salaries and real estate commissions. They did not have $14,000 in liquid capital sitting in a checking account. They had pledged my trust fund as the collateral, assuming I would never find out, or assuming that if I did, I would simply fall in line and pay the bill to protect the family name. Now they were staring at a corporate demand for payment that explicitly threatened default and asset seizure. The property management company they thought they were dealing with had vanished, replaced by a faceless, aggressive corporate entity named Obsidian Holdings. They had no idea I controlled the entity, but they knew they were legally responsible for the debt. The panic inside the suburban estate must have been absolute. 5 minutes after I ended the call with Chantel, my encrypted tablet chimed with a priority notification. I had blocked their phone numbers, but I maintained a dedicated monitored email address for family emergencies, a digital channel I rarely checked unless absolutely necessary. A new message had just bypassed my filters. The sender was listed as the administrative office of the Atlanta Fellowship Megachurch, the sprawling multi-million-dollar religious empire where my parents held absolute power. I opened the email. It was not a plea for help. It was not an apology for forging my signature or stealing my identity. It was a joint message from Vivian and Desmond, and it was written with the furious, commanding tone of royalty, demanding an audience with a disobedient subject. They did not ask how I was doing. They did not address the frozen credit cards or the canceled honeymoon. They bypassed the emotional fallout entirely and focused purely on the immediate threat to their pristine public image and their financial survival. The email was short, aggressive, and entirely devoid of parental warmth. They commanded me to appear at the megachurch's executive boardroom immediately. I stared at the screen, analyzing the tactical choice of location. They did not summon me to the family estate. They did not ask to meet at a neutral restaurant or a coffee shop. They demanded I come to the executive boardroom of their church. That specific room was the absolute epicenter of Vivian and Desmond's power. It was a massive, intimidating space lined with mahogany panels, leather chairs, and enormous portraits of my parents projecting spiritual and financial authority. It was the room where they fired staff, disciplined church elders, and orchestrated their social climbing campaigns. By summoning me to the boardroom, they were attempting to strip away my corporate authority and force me back into the role of the subservient, subordinate daughter. They wanted to place me in an environment where they held all the cards, where the sheer scale of the building would intimidate me into compliance. They intended to corner me on their holy turf, use their spiritual authority to crush my rebellion, and demand that I unlock the accounts and pay the Obsidian Holdings invoice before their reputation was ruined. They thought they were bringing a frightened daughter to the principal's office for a scolding. They had no earthly idea they were actually inviting a predator into their sanctuary. I closed the email application and stood up from my desk. The corporate audit phase of this operation was complete. The financial traps were locked, the credit lines were dead, and the eviction clock was aggressively ticking down to zero. The digital war was over, and the physical confrontation was about to begin. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I was not going to arrive at the megachurch looking like a stressed, emotional victim. I bypassed my casual weekend wear and selected a razor-sharp charcoal gray designer suit, the exact armor I wore when delivering catastrophic audit findings to hostile corporate boards. I paired it with a stark white silk blouse and black stiletto heels that echoed like gavel strikes on hardwood floors. I pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless style, ensuring there was absolutely no softness in my appearance. I was going to step into the heart of their empire and look them dead in the eye. I was going to let them sit in their expensive leather chairs and demand my obedience. I was going to let Vivian preach about family loyalty, and I was going to let Desmond attempt to exert his patriarchal control. I would let them exhaust every single manipulation tactic in their arsenal. And then I was going to drop the Obsidian Holdings ownership documents directly onto their mahogany boardroom table. I grabbed my leather briefcase, slid the encrypted tablet, and the thick, verified legal file inside, and walked out the door of my condo. The drive to the megachurch would take exactly 20 minutes. The destruction of their perfectly curated reality would take considerably less. The drive to the sprawling campus of the Atlanta Fellowship megachurch took exactly 20 minutes, just as I had calculated. The church loomed ahead like a monument to tax-exempt vanity, a massive architectural flex of glass steel and perfectly manicured landscaping that consumed an entire suburban block. I pulled my vehicle into the VIP executive lot, completely bypassing the sprawling congregational parking rows. As I stepped out onto the pristine pavement, the thick Georgia humidity hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing except a deep, Arctic calm. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal designer suit, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and walked toward the private administrative entrance. The interior of the executive wing was explicitly designed to intimidate. It felt more like the headquarters of a Fortune 500 hedge fund than a place of spiritual worship. The floors were polished Italian marble. The lighting was flawlessly calibrated to project an aura of divine warmth, and the security staff wore tailored suits with earpieces. An usher, recognizing my face from the rare forced holiday appearances I had made over the years, immediately stiffened. He did not ask how I was doing or offer a polite greeting. He simply gestured for me to follow him, leading me down the long, silent corridor toward the executive boardroom. He opened the heavy, soundproofed double doors and stepped aside. I walked in the sharp, rhythmic strike of my stiletto heels echoing against the hardwood floor. The setup was a textbook psychological ambush. The boardroom was cavernous, dominated by a 30-foot mahogany table, polished to a mirror finish. Towering custom-painted oil portraits of my parents hung on the far wall, silently projecting their manufactured authority over the space. They had positioned themselves strategically at the head of the table, flanked by their chosen audience. Desmond sat in his high-backed leather chair, wearing a dark, custom-tailored suit, his hands steepled in front of him. Vivian sat to his right, draped in an elegant conservative dress, her posture rigid, and her face arranged in an expression of pained maternal disappointment. Trayvon and Chantel were seated directly across from them. Trayvon looked physically ill. The arrogant swagger he usually carried had entirely evaporated, replaced by the twitchy, erratic energy of a cornered animal. Chantel sat rigidly beside him, clutching a designer tissue, her eyes darting nervously around the room. But the true tactical element of this ambush sat to my father's left. Two senior church elders, men I recognized instantly as the primary financial backers and social enforcers of the congregation. Their presence was a highly calculated move by Vivian and Desmond. The elders were brought in to serve as moral witnesses, a spiritual jury meant to shame me into submission. My parents wanted an audience to watch them put their rebellious corporate daughter back in her place. I did not sit down. I stood at the opposite end of the vast table, resting both hands lightly on my briefcase, and looked at them with clinical detachment. Desmond was the first to speak. He utilized his pulpit voice, the deep, resonant baritone he deployed every Sunday, to command the attention of 5,000 paying parishioners. "Zuri," he began, his tone heavy with manufactured sorrow. "Take a seat. We have called you here today not just as your parents, but as your spiritual guides. This family is built on a foundation of grace, unity, and Black excellence. You know this. We have spent our entire lives building a legacy in this city, a reputation that honors our community and our faith, and yet you have chosen to invite chaos into our sanctuary. I remained standing, my face a mask of absolute professional indifference. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to continue without the defensive reaction he expected. "What you did today," Desmond continued, his voice rising in volume to fill the room. "Freezing accounts, initiating fraudulent chargebacks, attacking your own brother on the week of his holy matrimony. It is an act of profound spiritual sickness. You are allowing the devil of jealousy to consume your heart. You are letting petty resentment over a wedding guest list blind you to the sacred duty of family loyalty." The sheer absurdity of the narrative was breathtaking. They were actually trying to frame felony identity theft as a holy crusade, and my refusal to be a silent victim as a spiritual failing. Desmond was performing for the elders, painting a picture of a jealous, bitter spinster sister who was lashing out because she did not get to attend a luxury yacht party. Vivian leaned forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart. She adopted her soft, trembling matriarch voice, the exact pitch and cadence that routinely brought her congregation to tears. "Zuri, my child," Vivian said, shaking her head slowly, "we understand that you are hurting. We understand that your corporate life is cold and lonely, and that seeing Trevon and Chantel so deeply in love, so embraced by high society, must have triggered a deep insecurity within you. But to lash out with financial sabotage, to threaten the vendors and embarrass this family in front of our community, it is wicked, Zuri. It is a spiritual rot." She gestured toward the two elders, who nodded in solemn, judgmental agreement. They were looking at me as if I were a diseased branch that needed to be aggressively pruned from the family tree. "We brought Elder Thomas and Elder Davis here today because this is no longer just a family dispute," Vivian continued, her eyes locking onto mine with venomous intensity. "This is a crisis of morality. You are actively trying to destroy your brother's future out of spite. You have illegally manipulated banking systems to freeze funds that Trevon desperately needs to establish his new household. You are attempting to drag our pristine name into the mud." Trevon finally spoke, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "The building management in Buckhead just sent a default notice, Zuri. They said the rent payment failed and they are going to lock us out by 5 o'clock. The wedding vendors are threatening to call the police on me. You have to stop this. You are ruining my life." Desmond slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. The sound cracked like a gunshot, a deliberate display of patriarchal dominance designed to make me flinch. I did not blink. "Enough," Desmond boomed. "We are ending this tantrum right now. We are a family of black excellence, and we do not handle our disputes through secular sabotage. We protect our own. We shield our blood from secular ruin." He reached into a leather folder on the table and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished wood until it stopped a few feet in front of me. "This," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a dangerous commanding register, "is a retroactive authorization form. My attorneys drafted it an hour ago. It legally states that you gave Trevon verbal permission to utilize your credit lines up to $200,000 and that you willingly acted as a guarantor for his residential lease. It classifies the current banking freezes as an accidental misunderstanding on your part. You are going to sign it, Zuri. You are going to sign it right now, contact the bank, and lift the fraud alerts. You will protect your brother from secular ruin, and you will restore the financial access immediately." Vivian nodded firmly, her eyes glittering with cold authority. "If you sign it, we will forgive this terrible lapse in judgment. We will welcome you back into the fold, and we will pray for your jealous heart to heal. If you refuse, you will walk out of this church with no family, no spiritual covering, and no future in our community. We will cut you off permanently." I stared down at the document. They had literally printed a confession for me to sign. They wanted me to commit perjury to legally incriminate myself and to permanently bind my financial future to Trevon's fraudulent debt. They genuinely believed that the threat of being exiled from their toxic performative family was a punishment so severe that I would gladly accept financial ruin to avoid it. The two elders sat up straighter, crossing their arms, waiting for me to break down, apologize, and sign my life away to preserve the church's reputation. Sensing the heavy silence, Chantel decided it was time to deploy her own weapon. She realized that the intimidation tactics needed an emotional anchor to truly sell the narrative to the elders. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud theatrical sob. "I just do not understand why she hates me so much," Chantel wailed, her shoulders shaking violently. She peered through her fingers, ensuring the elders were watching her performance. "We just wanted a beautiful start to our lives together. Trayvon works so hard. We are just trying to build a Christian home. And she is trying to destroy my new marriage before it even begins. She wants us to be homeless. She wants us to be humiliated in front of all my friends in Buckhead. How can a sister be so cruel?" Chantel let out another dramatic wail, leaning heavily against Trayvon, who awkwardly patted her shoulder. It was a masterclass in manipulative victimhood, the poor innocent bride being terrorized by the bitter corporate spinster. The elders murmured in sympathetic agreement, casting glares of absolute disgust in my direction. Vivian looked at me, a cold, triumphant gleam in her eye. She thought she had won. She thought the combination of religious shaming, patriarchal authority, and Chantel's tearful performance had effectively cornered me. She pointed to the pen resting beside the printed document. "Sign the paper, Zuri. End this embarrassment." I stood motionless at the end of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not defend myself against the accusations of jealousy, and I certainly did not engage with Chantel's pathetic theatrical display. I looked at the retroactive authorization form, then up at the towering portraits of my parents, and finally at the two elders who had been brought in to witness my submission. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just watched the prey willingly walk into a sealed room and lock the door from the inside. I reached down and gripped the handle of my thick black leather briefcase. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I hoisted it into the air and brought it down hard onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy metallic clack of the brass locks hitting the wood echoed through the cavernous boardroom, instantly silencing Chantel's fake crying. "You brought an audience," I said, my voice cutting through the dead air with absolute clinical precision. "How remarkably convenient." I snapped the twin brass locks on the briefcase simultaneously. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a judge's gavel in the cavernous space. I flipped the heavy leather lid back, revealing a meticulously organized, color-coded filing system. I did not raise my voice to match their frantic emotional pitch. In my profession, the louder someone yells, the weaker their position. I possess the absolute truth, and the truth requires zero volume to be devastating. I reached into the briefcase and extracted the first file. It was bound in heavy crimson cardstock. I bypassed my father's outstretched hand entirely. Instead, I walked directly to the side of the massive mahogany table and placed the dossier precisely between Elder Thomas and Elder Davis. "Since my parents brought you here as moral witnesses to judge my spiritual character," I said, my voice echoing with clinical authority, "I believe it is only fair that you review the full scope of the morality currently on trial in your boardroom." Elder Thomas, a retired Superior Court judge who handled the church's massive real estate acquisitions, frowned deeply but opened the folder. Elder Davis leaned in beside him. "What you are looking at," I explained, pacing slowly back to my position at the end of the table, "is a comprehensive digital forensics report. Page 1 details the raw IP logs and geographic tracking data for the fraudulent charges placed on my corporate Platinum account. Page 2 contains the device identification tags. You will notice the MAC address associated with $85,000 in unauthorized yacht charter charges belongs directly to a rose gold smartphone registered to Chantel." Chantel's theatrical heaving sobs stopped instantly. The transition was so abrupt, so entirely devoid of natural human emotion that it was chilling. The crumpled designer tissue dropped from her face, revealing dry, terrified eyes. The victim routine had been violently terminated by the introduction of undeniable facts. I kept my gaze locked on the two elders. Page 3 contains the most critical piece of evidence. It is the metadata log for a commercial residential lease executed for a luxury penthouse in Buckhead. The document required a financial guarantor. You will see the digital signature time-stamped at 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Below that, you will see the security camera still frame I legally acquired from the coffee shop where that IP address originated. It clearly shows my brother Trayvon typing on his laptop, actively forging my signature to secure a $14,000 a month apartment he has absolutely no means of paying for. Trayvon turned a sickening shade of translucent gray. He shrank back into his expensive leather chair, his jaw hanging slightly open, his eyes darting frantically between me and the church elders. He was watching his entire manufactured reputation evaporate in real time. "This is not a petty misunderstanding or a family dispute fueled by jealousy," I stated, my tone dropping to a hard, unyielding register. "This is felony wire fraud. It is aggravated identity theft. It is the interstate transmission of stolen funds. These are federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. Vanguard Horizon's fraud division has already processed the chargebacks, and the federal authorities have been provided with the exact data packet you are currently holding." Elder Thomas slowly looked up from the crimson folder. The expression on his face had shifted from pious judgment to absolute unadulterated horror. He was a man who understood the law. He understood liability. He suddenly realized that Vivian and Desmond had summoned him to this room not to mediate a sibling rivalry, but to actively pressure a victim into covering up a federal crime committed by the pastor's son. "Desmond," Elder Thomas said, his voice grave and shaking slightly. "Is this true? Did Trayvon forge these documents?" My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The booming pulpit voice had abandoned him. He looked at the undeniable photographic evidence resting on the table and realized there was no spiritual platitude that could explain away a digital IP log. And as for the innocent bride, I continued, not allowing the silence to settle. I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out a navy blue folder. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood, stopping directly in front of Chantel. "Since we are discussing secular ruin, we should address the foundation of this marriage," I said, stepping toward her. Chantel pressed herself flat against the back of her chair, as if I were holding a weapon. "You wanted the elders to believe I was trying to destroy your elite social standing. The problem with that narrative is that your elite standing is a complete hallucination." I looked down at her, stripping away every ounce of her fake socialite armor. "That folder contains a deep dive, financial background check on your immediate family, Chantel, the prominent medical supply company your father supposedly owns. It went into Chapter 7 bankruptcy 3 months ago. The estate in Alpharetta. It is currently facing foreclosure proceedings. The luxury vehicles your parents drove to the wedding leased and currently flagged for repossession. You currently have 6 active IRS tax liens filed against your family name." Trayvon's head snapped toward his new wife. The shock on his face was genuine, raw, and entirely pathetic. He had targeted Chantel because he believed her family possessed the generational wealth necessary to fund his startup delusions and elevate his status. He thought he was marrying into a high-net-worth dynasty that would overlook his lack of personal capital. "She is entirely broke, Trayvon," I said, offering him a cold, pitying smile. "She targeted you because you drove a leased sports car and threw around the name of a megachurch. She thought she was securing a wealthy pastor's son who could bail her family out of bankruptcy. You targeted her because you thought she was an elite heiress. You are 2 unemployed grifters who accidentally conned each other, and you funded your entire fake fairy tale using my stolen credit card." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a fatal car crash. Chantel was staring at the table, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths of total humiliation. She had been exposed in front of her new husband, her powerful new in-laws, and the senior leadership of the church. The designer clothes she wore suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. Trayvon buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic groan. The realization that he had married a bankrupt fraudster, combined with the looming threat of federal prison, had completely broken his arrogant spirit. He had nothing left. The 2 elders were openly staring at Vivian and Desmond with expressions of profound disgust. The pristine, holy image of the Black Excellence family had been gutted, revealing a core of deceit, theft, and desperate social climbing. That was when Vivian finally snapped. The carefully curated mask of the elegant spiritual matriarch shattered into 1,000 pieces. She realized that the elders were lost. She realized that the narrative was dead. She realized that her golden son was facing criminal charges, and that her new daughter-in-law was a broke liability. Cornered and desperate, Vivian abandoned her church persona and resorted to raw, vicious panic. She stood up so violently that her heavy leather chair slammed backward into the mahogany paneling. "Stop it!" Vivian shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the high ceilings. She slammed her manicured hands flat against the boardroom table, glaring at me with unhinged fury. "You stop this right now, Zuri. You are tearing this family apart over numbers on a piece of paper. We are your blood." She reached out and tried to snatch the crimson folder away from Elder Thomas, but the retired judge swiftly pulled it out of her reach, his eyes narrowing at her erratic behavior. "Family protects family," Vivian yelled, entirely abandoning any semblance of dignity. She pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You have more money than you know what to do with. You sit in your glass office hoarding wealth while your brother is trying to build a legacy. You owe him this. You owe us this. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. And this is how you repay us, by bringing secular documents into the house of the Lord to shame your own flesh and blood." She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with the terror of losing control. She turned to the elders, her voice taking on a desperate, pleading tone. "Do not look at those papers," Vivian commanded them, pointing at the files. "This is a private internal family matter. The devil is using her to attack this ministry. We will handle the debt. We will cover the credit cards. Trevon made a small mistake, but we protect our own in this family. Family protects family." I stood perfectly still, watching the matriarch of the Atlanta Fellowship megachurch publicly unravel. She was explicitly demanding that senior church leadership ignore a felony crime to protect her son. She was admitting in front of witnesses that she believed family loyalty superseded the law, morality, and basic human decency. I waited until her shouting echoed away into the silence of the room. I looked at my mother, absorbing the sheer toxic entitlement radiating from her posture. "You are absolutely right, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that forced everyone in the room to lean forward. "Family protects family, and since you are so eager to protect Trayvon's financial mistakes, I brought the documentation that proves exactly how far you are willing to go to cover for him." I reached into the black leather briefcase one last time. I pulled out the final folder. It was thicker than the others, bound in heavy, unmarked black cardstock. I locked eyes with my mother and slid the final, most devastating folder across the polished table. The heavy black cardstock glided smoothly over the polished mahogany. Vivian lunged for it, her manicured nails scraping the wood in a desperate, frantic bid to intercept the document. But Elder Thomas was faster. The retired Superior Court judge placed his large, weathered hand firmly over the file, stopping its momentum dead in the center of the table. He looked at my mother, his eyes narrowing at her sudden, uncharacteristic display of panic. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. I watched the blood drain entirely from her face. She knew exactly what kind of paper trail she and Desmond had left behind. They had always operated under the arrogant assumption that their spiritual authority placed them above secular scrutiny. They believed that because they controlled the church, they controlled the reality within its walls. They never anticipated an apex corporate auditor treating their holy empire like a corrupt shell company. When Vanguard Horizon flagged Trayvon's fraudulent lease agreement, standard protocol required a deep dive into the financial stability of the guarantors. I explained, my voice echoing evenly across the vast boardroom. "To verify your ability to cover a $14,000 a month penthouse, my algorithms automatically pulled the public tax filings, the corporate registry data, and the associated nonprofit disclosures linked to your names. What I found was not a temporary lapse in judgment. I found a systematic multi-year embezzlement operation." Elder Thomas opened the black folder. The crisp, brightly lit room seemed to plunge into a suffocating silence. He flipped past the title page, his eyes scanning the dense color-coded spreadsheets I had meticulously compiled. Beside him, Elder Davis leaned in, adjusting his reading glasses. Traven's Phantom Tech Company was not his first failure, I stated, turning my gaze to the elders. He has registered 3 previous limited liability companies over the last 4 years: a cryptocurrency startup, a luxury dropshipping enterprise, and a boutique marketing firm. All 3 generated 0 legitimate revenue. All 3 went functionally bankrupt. Yet Trayvon has continually driven leased sports cars, worn designer suits, and maintained residence in premium zip codes. The math did not align, so I followed the capital. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, my stiletto heels providing a sharp, rhythmic underscore to the devastation I was delivering. Page 2 of that dossier details the banking routing numbers, I instructed. You will see that Trayvon's failed ventures were kept afloat by massive regular influxes of untraceable cash. Those wire transfers did not originate from angel investors or venture capital firms. They originated directly from the Atlanta Fellowship Community Outreach Fund. Elder Davis gasped audibly. He was the senior official overseeing the church's charitable initiatives. He was the man who looked struggling parishioners in the eye and told them the church could not afford to help with their heating bills or medical debts due to budget shortfalls. Look at the ledger on page 4, I commanded. Elder Thomas turned the page, his hands beginning to tremble with absolute fury. 2 years ago, $50,000 earmarked for the Affordable Housing Initiative was wired to an offshore consulting firm. I recited from memory, knowing every single digit of their fraud by heart. That consulting firm was registered to Desmond. The funds were then immediately funneled into Trayvon's cryptocurrency startup to cover margin calls. Last year, $75,000 from the Youth Scholarship Drive was diverted under the guise of an anonymous administrative expense. The routing numbers prove that money went directly to cover the deposit on the suburban estate's pool renovations and Vivian's personal styling retainers. "This is a lie!" Desmond bellowed, surging to his feet. He slammed his fists onto the table, trying to summon the booming patriarchal authority he used to command his congregation. "These are fabricated documents. You are looking at the spiteful fabrications of a jealous, bitter child who wants to destroy this ministry. Those were administrative reallocations. We manage a massive operating budget. It was an internal bridge loan." Elder Thomas looked up from the folder. The retired judge did not look at Desmond with the reverence of a parishioner. He looked at him with the cold, lethal disgust of a magistrate looking at a convicted felon. "A bridge loan?" Elder Thomas asked, his voice deathly quiet. "You authorized $75,000 of scholarship money to build a swimming pool at your private residence, Desmond. You wired $50,000 of affordable housing funds to a shell company to pay off your son's gambling debts. I am looking at the official bank timestamps. I am looking at your authorized digital signature on every single transfer." "We were going to replenish it," Vivian cried out, her voice cracking in a shrill, desperate whine. She grabbed Desmond's arm, pulling at his suit jacket. "The church owes us. We built this congregation from nothing. We gave our lives to this ministry. We are entitled to compensation for our sacrifices. The community expects us to maintain an image of Black excellence. We had to protect the family brand. You stole from the widows and the poor to fund your son's delusions," Elder Davis said, standing up from his chair. His face was twisted in profound grief and rage. "We turned away families facing eviction because you told the board the outreach fund was depleted. You let people in our community go hungry so Chantel could carry a $10,000 handbag and Trayvon could pretend to be a billionaire." The absolute reality of their destruction finally crashed down on Vivian. The psychological ambush she had planned had entirely backfired. She had brought the elders into this room to shame me, to force me into compliance under the weight of their spiritual authority. Instead, she had hand-delivered the exact audience I needed to execute her social and financial ruin. A public audit meant public disgrace. The elite circles of Atlanta, the wealthy socialites she desperately courted, the country club board members, they would all shun her. The designer clothes, the luxury vehicles, the sprawling estate, it was all purchased with stolen charity money. Her entire kingdom was built on the backs of the vulnerable people she preached to every Sunday. Vivian collapsed into her chair. The proud, untouchable matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, weeping woman facing the very real threat of federal prison. She looked at me, her face streaked with mascara, completely abandoning her pride. "Please, Zuri," Vivian begged, her voice a wet, ragged sob. She reached her hands out toward me across the table. "Please stop this. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. They will take the house. The government will seize everything. We will be ruined. I am begging you, please withdraw the files. We will pay you back. We will do whatever you want. Please have mercy on your family." I looked at her outstretched hands. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no lingering daughterly affection, no urge to comfort her. "You do not have a family, Vivian," I said, my tone as cold and unyielding as concrete. "You have a business model, and your business model is bankrupt." Elder Thomas closed the black folder. He did not ask for a vote. He did not suggest a prayer or a period of spiritual reflection. He operated with the swift, decisive action of a man protecting a multi-million-dollar institution from a terminal liability. "Desmond," Elder Thomas declared, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, "you are stripped of your pastoral duties effective immediately. You are suspended from the executive board without pay. You will hand over your access keys, your corporate credit cards, and your administrative passwords before you leave this room." Desmond opened his mouth to argue, but Elder Davis cut him off. "We are locking down the servers," Elder Davis added, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "We are initiating a full, independent legal and forensic audit of every single account tied to this church over the last decade. If these ledgers are accurate, Desmond and I pray to God they are not, we will have no choice but to contact the district attorney and hand over everything." The room descended into a chaotic, fragmented nightmare. Desmond sank into his chair, staring blankly at the wall, a broken man who had just lost his entire empire in the span of 5 minutes. Vivian was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, her elegant dress pooling around her as she rocked back and forth, mourning the death of her social status. Chantel sat frozen in her seat, clutching her designer bag, looking wildly between the door and her new husband, calculating how quickly she could file for an annulment to distance herself from the incoming federal indictments. And then there was Trayvon. Even as the walls of his parents' empire collapsed into ash, even as the threat of prison loomed over his family, Trayvon's pathological narcissism refused to accept defeat. His ego was a parasite that could not comprehend its own death. He looked at his weeping mother, his disgraced father, and then he looked at me. He jumped to his feet, his face flushed with a manic, desperate energy. He pointed a finger at my face, clinging to the only piece of his fake reality he thought he still controlled. "You think you won!" Trayvon yelled, his voice cracking hysterically. "You think you can just come in here and destroy us? You're nothing but a bitter, lonely auditor. We don't need the church's money. We don't need your credit cards. You can't do this to me. We still have the penthouse. I'm still a CEO. We have a $14,000 a month luxury suite in Buckhead, and you can't touch it." I did not answer him. I did not need to. I simply looked at my watch. Trayvon opened the email first. The timestamp showed he opened it, closed it, and then opened it again 3 seconds later. He was likely staring at the $14,250 balance, trying to comprehend why a property management company he had never heard of was demanding immediate payment with 0 grace period. 10 seconds later, Chantel opened her copy. 2 minutes after that, the tracking software indicated that both Vivian and Desmond had accessed the guarantor copies of the invoice. The digital silence in my office was profound, a sharp contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was erupting across the city. They were cornered. The frozen credit card meant they had no liquidity. The angry wedding vendors meant their social facade was burning. And the Obsidian Holdings invoice meant their physical sanctuary was under direct threat. I stood up from my desk, leaving the monitors glowing, and walked into my kitchen. I felt completely detached, operating with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a senior auditor dismantling a corrupt shell company. I poured myself a tall glass of iced water and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there in the sprawling expanse of Buckhead, Trevon and Chantel were trapped in a penthouse that was rapidly transforming from a luxury suite into a legal cage. My personal cell phone had remained face down and silent for hours. I had blocked Trevon, Chantel, and my parents on every conceivable communication channel. My call logs showed a graveyard of rejected attempts. Trayvon had tried another 45 times. Chantel had attempted 30 calls. Vivian and Desmond had dialed my number 20 times between them. They were collectively slamming into a digital brick wall, denied the one thing toxic families rely on to survive: the ability to control the narrative. I walked back into my home office and sat down just as a sharp, unfamiliar ringtone shattered the quiet. I glanced at the phone resting on the glass desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. It was not a registered contact. It was not a corporate line. It was a burner phone, or perhaps a prepaid device purchased from a convenience store. They had realized they were blocked and were now resorting to basic evasion tactics to breach my perimeter. I let it ring 3 times, analyzing the strategic value of answering. I did not want to negotiate, but I did want to verify the exact level of their desperation. I reached out, swiped the screen to accept the call, and brought the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. When the voice finally spoke, all the performative sweetness, all the high society affectation, and all the fake Instagram polish had been entirely stripped away. It was Chantel. She sounded breathless, enraged, and completely devoid of any self-awareness. She did not sound like a woman who had just been caught committing felony wire fraud. She sounded like an entitled customer filing a complaint with a subordinate. "The rent is overdue. Did you transfer the money yet? The building management is threatening to lock us out. Don't embarrass us." I sat perfectly still, processing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her demand. Chantel genuinely believed that I was still on the hook for their lifestyle. Even after the credit card was frozen, even after the wedding vendors had likely ripped into them, her first instinct was to call the victim of her financial crimes and demand that I pay the new landlord. She thought the Obsidian Holdings invoice was just another bill for me to handle. She had no idea she was speaking directly to the CEO of the company, threatening to throw her onto the street. Her command echoed in my ear. "Don't embarrass us." That was the core of her entire existence. The legal peril, the stolen identity, the forged guarantor documents, none of that mattered to Chantel. The only thing that mattered was the absolute terror of being exposed as a fraud in front of the Buckhead elite. She was terrified that the concierge downstairs would see her being escorted out by corporate security. She was terrified of the embarrassment. I let the silence stretch across the line, allowing her frantic energy to hit a solid wall of ice. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse. I spoke with the chilling clinical calmness of an auditor delivering a final verdict. "Didn't I tell you? Just like your wedding, my money is only for special people." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button, cutting the connection before she could even draw a breath to respond. The click of the receiver was the most satisfying sound I had heard all week. I immediately blocked the burner number, ensuring she could not call back. I sat back and took a slow sip of my iced water, letting the weight of the interaction settle. Chantel was now spiraling. She had called her primary funding source, demanded money to stop an eviction, and was met with a cold, absolute rejection. She and Trevon were sitting in that penthouse staring at an unyielding deadline, possessing absolutely no means to satisfy the debt. But the true squeeze was not about Chantel and Trevon. They were just the symptoms of the disease. The real disease was Vivian and Desmond. They were the ones who had enabled the fraud. They were the ones who had notarized a forged document, leveraging my emergency trust fund. They had co-signed the commercial lease, legally anchoring their own financial future to Trayvon's fake empire. When the Obsidian Holdings invoice landed in their inboxes, they would have instantly recognized the legal peril. Vivian and Desmond lived month to month, maintaining an illusion of wealth, funded by church salaries and real estate commissions. They did not have $14,000 in liquid capital sitting in a checking account. They had pledged my trust fund as the collateral, assuming I would never find out, or assuming that if I did, I would simply fall in line and pay the bill to protect the family name. Now they were staring at a corporate demand for payment that explicitly threatened default and asset seizure. The property management company they thought they were dealing with had vanished, replaced by a faceless, aggressive corporate entity named Obsidian Holdings. They had no idea I controlled the entity, but they knew they were legally responsible for the debt. The panic inside the suburban estate must have been absolute. 5 minutes after I ended the call with Chantel, my encrypted tablet chimed with a priority notification. I had blocked their phone numbers, but I maintained a dedicated monitored email address for family emergencies, a digital channel I rarely checked unless absolutely necessary. A new message had just bypassed my filters. The sender was listed as the administrative office of the Atlanta Fellowship Megachurch, the sprawling multi-million-dollar religious empire where my parents held absolute power. I opened the email. It was not a plea for help. It was not an apology for forging my signature or stealing my identity. It was a joint message from Vivian and Desmond, and it was written with the furious, commanding tone of royalty, demanding an audience with a disobedient subject. They did not ask how I was doing. They did not address the frozen credit cards or the canceled honeymoon. They bypassed the emotional fallout entirely and focused purely on the immediate threat to their pristine public image and their financial survival. The email was short, aggressive, and entirely devoid of parental warmth. They commanded me to appear at the megachurch's executive boardroom immediately. I stared at the screen, analyzing the tactical choice of location. They did not summon me to the family estate. They did not ask to meet at a neutral restaurant or a coffee shop. They demanded I come to the executive boardroom of their church. That specific room was the absolute epicenter of Vivian and Desmond's power. It was a massive, intimidating space lined with mahogany panels, leather chairs, and enormous portraits of my parents projecting spiritual and financial authority. It was the room where they fired staff, disciplined church elders, and orchestrated their social climbing campaigns. By summoning me to the boardroom, they were attempting to strip away my corporate authority and force me back into the role of the subservient subordinate daughter. They wanted to place me in an environment where they held all the cards, where the sheer scale of the building would intimidate me into compliance. They intended to corner me on their holy turf, use their spiritual authority to crush my rebellion, and demand that I unlock the accounts and pay the Obsidian Holdings invoice before their reputation was ruined. They thought they were bringing a frightened daughter to the principal's office for a scolding. They had no earthly idea they were actually inviting a predator into their sanctuary. I closed the email application and stood up from my desk. The corporate audit phase of this operation was complete. The financial traps were locked, the credit lines were dead, and the eviction clock was aggressively ticking down to zero. The digital war was over, and the physical confrontation was about to begin. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I was not going to arrive at the mega church looking like a stressed, emotional victim. I bypassed my casual weekend wear and selected a razor-sharp charcoal gray designer suit, the exact armor I wore when delivering catastrophic audit findings to hostile corporate boards. I paired it with a stark white silk blouse and black stiletto heels that echoed like gavel strikes on hardwood floors. I pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless style, ensuring there was absolutely no softness in my appearance. I was going to step into the heart of their empire and look them dead in the eye. I was going to let them sit in their expensive leather chairs and demand my obedience. I was going to let Vivian preach about family loyalty, and I was going to let Desmond attempt to exert his patriarchal control. I would let them exhaust every single manipulation tactic in their arsenal. And then I was going to drop the Obsidian Holdings ownership documents directly onto their mahogany boardroom table. I grabbed my leather briefcase, slid the encrypted tablet and the thick, verified legal file inside, and walked out the door of my condo. The drive to the megachurch would take exactly 20 minutes. The destruction of their perfectly curated reality would take considerably less. The heavy black cardstock glided smoothly over the polished mahogany. Vivian lunged for it, her manicured nails scraping the wood in a desperate, frantic bid to intercept the document. But Elder Thomas was faster. The retired Superior Court judge placed his large, weathered hand firmly over the file, stopping its momentum dead in the center of the table. He looked at my mother, his eyes narrowing at her sudden, uncharacteristic display of panic. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. I watched the blood drain entirely from her face. She knew exactly what kind of paper trail she and Desmond had left behind. They had always operated under the arrogant assumption that their spiritual authority placed them above secular scrutiny. They believed that because they controlled the church, they controlled the reality within its walls. They never anticipated an apex corporate auditor treating their holy empire like a corrupt shell company. When Vanguard Horizon flagged Trayvon's fraudulent lease agreement, standard protocol required a deep dive into the financial stability of the guarantors. I explained, my voice echoing evenly across the vast boardroom. To verify your ability to cover a $14,000 a month penthouse, my algorithms automatically pulled the public tax filings, the corporate registry data, and the associated nonprofit disclosures linked to your names. What I found was not a temporary lapse in judgment. I found a systematic, multi-year embezzlement operation. Elder Thomas opened the black folder. The crisp, brightly lit room seemed to plunge into a suffocating silence. He flipped past the title page, his eyes scanning the dense color-coded spreadsheets I had meticulously compiled. Beside him, Elder Davis leaned in, adjusting his reading glasses. Trayvon's Phantom Tech Company was not his first failure, I stated, turning my gaze to the elders. He has registered 3 previous limited liability companies over the last 4 years: a cryptocurrency startup, a luxury dropshipping enterprise, and a boutique marketing firm. All 3 generated zero legitimate revenue. All 3 went functionally bankrupt. Yet Trayvon has continually driven leased sports cars, worn designer suits, and maintained residence in premium zip codes. The math did not align, so I followed the capital. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, my stiletto heels providing a sharp, rhythmic underscore to the devastation I was delivering. Page 2 of that dossier details the banking routing numbers, I instructed. You will see that Trayvon's failed ventures were kept afloat by massive regular influxes of untraceable cash. Those wire transfers did not originate from angel investors or venture capital firms. They originated directly from the Atlanta Fellowship Community Outreach Fund. Elder Davis gasped audibly. He was the senior official overseeing the church's charitable initiatives. He was the man who looked struggling parishioners in the eye and told them the church could not afford to help with their heating bills or medical debts due to budget shortfalls. Look at the ledger on page 4, I commanded. Elder Thomas turned the page, his hands beginning to tremble with absolute fury. 2 years ago, $50,000 earmarked for the Affordable Housing Initiative was wired to an offshore consulting firm. I recited from memory, knowing every single digit of their fraud by heart. That consulting firm was registered to Desmond. The funds were then immediately funneled into Trayvon's cryptocurrency startup to cover margin calls. Last year, $75,000 from the Youth Scholarship Drive was diverted under the guise of an anonymous administrative expense. The routing numbers prove that money went directly to cover the deposit on the suburban estate's pool renovations and Vivian's personal styling retainers. "This is a lie!" Desmond bellowed, surging to his feet. He slammed his fists onto the table, trying to summon the booming patriarchal authority he used to command his congregation. "These are fabricated documents. You are looking at the spiteful fabrications of a jealous, bitter child who wants to destroy this ministry. Those were administrative reallocations. We manage a massive operating budget. It was an internal bridge loan." Elder Thomas looked up from the folder. The retired judge did not look at Desmond with the reverence of a parishioner. He looked at him with the cold, lethal disgust of a magistrate looking at a convicted felon. "A bridge loan?" Elder Thomas asked, his voice deathly quiet. "You authorized $75,000 of scholarship money to build a swimming pool at your private residence, Desmond. You wired $50,000 of affordable housing funds to a shell company to pay off your son's gambling debts. I am looking at the official bank timestamps. I am looking at your authorized digital signature on every single transfer. We were going to replenish it, Vivian cried out, her voice cracking in a shrill, desperate whine. She grabbed Desmond's arm, pulling at his suit jacket. The church owes us. We built this congregation from nothing. We gave our lives to this ministry. We are entitled to compensation for our sacrifices. The community expects us to maintain an image of Black excellence. We had to protect the family brand. You stole from the widows and the poor to fund your son's delusions, Elder Davis said, standing up from his chair. His face was twisted in profound grief and rage. We turned away families facing eviction because you told the board the outreach fund was depleted. You let people in our community go hungry so Chantel could carry a $10,000 handbag and Trayvon could pretend to be a billionaire. The absolute reality of their destruction finally crashed down on Vivian. The psychological ambush she had planned had entirely backfired. She had brought the elders into this room to shame me, to force me into compliance under the weight of their spiritual authority. Instead, she had hand-delivered the exact audience I needed to execute her social and financial ruin. A public audit meant public disgrace. The elite circles of Atlanta, the wealthy socialites she desperately courted, the country club board members, they would all shun her. The designer clothes, the luxury vehicles, the sprawling estate, it was all purchased with stolen charity money. Her entire kingdom was built on the backs of the vulnerable people she preached to every Sunday. Vivian collapsed into her chair. The proud, untouchable matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, weeping woman facing the very real threat of federal prison. She looked at me, her face streaked with mascara, completely abandoning her pride. "Please, Zuri," Vivian begged, her voice a wet, ragged sob. She reached her hands out toward me across the table. "Please stop this. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. They will take the house. The government will seize everything. We will be ruined. I am begging you, please withdraw the files. We will pay you back. We will do whatever you want. Please have mercy on your family." I looked at her outstretched hands. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no lingering daughterly affection, no urge to comfort her. "You do not have a family, Vivian," I said, my tone as cold and unyielding as concrete. "You have a business model, and your business model is bankrupt." Elder Thomas closed the black folder. He did not ask for a vote. He did not suggest a prayer or a period of spiritual reflection. He operated with the swift, decisive action of a man protecting a multi-million-dollar institution from a terminal liability. "Desmond," Elder Thomas declared, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, "you are stripped of your pastoral duties, effective immediately. You are suspended from the executive board without pay. You will hand over your access keys, your corporate credit cards, and your administrative passwords before you leave this room." Desmond opened his mouth to argue, but Elder Davis cut him off. "We are locking down the servers," Elder Davis added, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "We are initiating a full, independent legal and forensic audit of every single account tied to this church over the last decade. If these ledgers are accurate, Desmond and I pray to God they are not, we will have no choice but to contact the district attorney and hand over everything." The room descended into a chaotic, fragmented nightmare. Desmond sank into his chair, staring blankly at the wall, a broken man who had just lost his entire empire in the span of 5 minutes. Vivian was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, her elegant dress pooling around her as she rocked back and forth, mourning the death of her social status. Chantel sat frozen in her seat, clutching her designer bag, looking wildly between the door and her new husband, calculating how quickly she could file for an annulment to distance herself from the incoming federal indictments. And then there was Trayvon. Even as the walls of his parents' empire collapsed into ash, even as the threat of prison loomed over his family, Trayvon's pathological narcissism refused to accept defeat. His ego was a parasite that could not comprehend its own death. He looked at his weeping mother, his disgraced father, and then he looked at me. He jumped to his feet, his face flushed with a manic, desperate energy. He pointed a finger at my face, clinging to the only piece of his fake reality he thought he still controlled. "You think you won?" Trayvon yelled, his voice cracking hysterically. "You think you can just come in here and destroy us?" You're nothing but a bitter, lonely auditor. We don't need the church's money. We don't need your credit cards. You can't do this to me. We still have the penthouse. I'm still a CEO. We have a $14,000 a month luxury suite in Buckhead and you can't touch it. I did not answer him. I did not need to. I simply looked at my watch. It was exactly 5 o'clock. The deadline had passed. I reached into the inner compartment of my briefcase and extracted one final document. It was not bound in standard corporate cardstock. It was encased in a heavy archival quality portfolio bearing the gold-embossed crest of Obsidian Holdings, LLC. I tossed it onto the mahogany surface. It slid with frictionless precision, coming to a dead stop right against Trayvon's white-knuckled fists. "You do not have a penthouse, Trayvon," I said, my voice echoing with absolute clinical finality. "You have a commercial residential lease that defaulted precisely 60 seconds ago. You assumed Obsidian Holdings was just a faceless property management firm. You failed to realize that when your luxury building ran into liquidity issues last quarter, my primary investment group purchased the debt. I am the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings. I own the deed to Penthouse 42A. I am your landlord." Trayvon stared at the embossed crest as if it were a venomous snake. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, I thought he might faint. The manic, desperate energy that had sustained his delusion finally snapped. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was not just broke, he was a trespasser in my property, and the eviction notice sitting in his inbox was not an idle threat. It was a legally binding execution order. "You," Trayvon gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You bought the building." "I bought the debt," I corrected coldly. "Because unlike you, I understand how to build real capital. You forged my signature on the guarantor documents to secure a lifestyle you could not afford utilizing a shell company with zero revenue. You handed me the legal right to evict you the moment the payment failed, and the payment just failed." Right on cue, the heavy soundproof double doors of the executive boardroom swung open. The two church elders who had been sitting in stunned silence practically jumped out of their leather chairs. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless gasp from the floor. Desmond froze his eyes, widening in absolute terror. A team of 4 private corporate security contractors stepped into the room, their dark suits and earpieces a stark contrast to the religious opulence of the space. They were immediately followed by 2 uniformed deputies from the local sheriff's department. The officers moved with purposeful, unyielding authority. The lead deputy held a thick stack of paperwork in his left hand, his right hand resting casually near his utility belt. "Trayvon Adams!" the lead deputy announced, his voice booming across the silent boardroom. Trayvon scrambled backward, his chair tipping over and crashing onto the marble floor. He pressed himself against the mahogany paneling, holding his hands up in a pathetic defensive gesture. "No," Trayvon stammered, shaking his head violently. "No, this is a mistake. My father is the pastor here. We are a good family. You cannot do this." The deputy ignored the plea entirely. He stepped forward, bridging the distance in 3 long strides. "Trayvon Adams, I have a warrant for your arrest on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and commercial forgery. I also have an immediate notice of eviction for your residence at Penthouse 42A, effective as of 1700 hours. Chantel erupted into pure hysterics. The faux socialite persona she had desperately clung to completely shattered. She shrieked a high-pitched, piercing sound that bounced off the cathedral ceilings. As the second deputy moved to secure the perimeter, he accidentally brushed past her chair. Chantel dropped to her knees, frantically grabbing at the pile of fake designer bags she had brought to the church. She clutched the counterfeit leather to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably, begging the officers not to seize her luggage. "Please," Chantel wailed, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "I did not know. I thought he was a CEO. I thought he had money. Do not arrest me. Please do not arrest me." The deputy bypassed her completely, focusing his attention on Trayvon. He grabbed Trayvon's arms, twisting them behind his back with practiced efficiency. The metallic, heavy click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around Trayvon's wrists sounded like a vault door locking permanently into place. You have the right to remain silent. The deputy recited, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Vivian screamed. It was a visceral, guttural sound of total defeat. The untouchable matriarch of the Atlanta Fellowship megachurch was lying on the floor, watching her golden child being read his Miranda rights, in front of the very elders she had summoned to witness her triumph. Her social kingdom was reduced to ash. The pristine, highly curated image of black excellence she had weaponized against me for my entire life was dead. She was no longer the elite pastor's wife. She was the mother of a handcuffed felon facing her own imminent audits for embezzling charity funds. The private security contractors moved to the boardroom table, methodically gathering the evidence files I had presented. They placed the IP logs, the forged lease agreements, and Desmond's financial transfer receipts into secure evidence bags. The church elders watched the entire process, their faces set in grim lines of disgust. They were already calculating the public relations nightmare that would hit the congregation by morning. Desmond was finished. Vivian was ruined. Trayvon was going to federal prison. As the deputies hauled Trayvon toward the boardroom doors, Desmond scrambled to his feet. He looked at his son, his face a mask of absolute desperation. Then, discarding every ounce of his remaining pride, Desmond turned to me. He did not look like a powerful spiritual leader. He looked pathetic, small, and utterly broken. "Zuri," Desmond pleaded, his voice cracking as he reached a trembling hand out toward me. "Zuri, please. You cannot let them take him away like this. You have the money. You have the resources. Please, you have to pay for his bail. We will figure this out as a family. I am begging you. He is your brother. Family protects family. You have to save him." I looked down at the man who had ignored my accomplishments, belittled my career, and enabled my financial abuse for decades. I looked at the mother sobbing on the floor, mourning her lost social status, rather than her corrupted morals. I looked at the brother being dragged out in handcuffs, paying the ultimate price for his arrogant delusion. They had called me socially unfit. They had excluded me from their lives because I did not fit their fake toxic aesthetic. They had treated me like a disposable asset, unworthy of basic respect, until they needed my capital to survive. I reached down and calmly snapped the twin brass locks of my empty briefcase closed. I stood up straight, smoothing out the lapels of my charcoal designer blazer with meticulous, unbothered precision. I met Desmond's desperate, pleading eyes with absolute serenity. I said, my voice perfectly level and echoing with chilling calmness. "But my presence here is causing too much social embarrassment for you all. I'll leave you to your special people." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on the executive boardroom, the weeping matriarch, the disgraced pastor, and the ruined golden child. I walked out through the heavy double doors, my stiletto heels striking the Italian marble floors, with the steady, victorious rhythm of absolute freedom. The church security staff parted to let me through, their eyes lowered in silent acknowledgement of the power dynamic that had just violently shifted. I walked out of the administrative wing and stepped into the thick, humid evening air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant orange and purple glow over the massive corporate campus. I walked to the VIP parking lot and approached my vehicle. The sleek black sports car gleamed under the twilight sky. I opened the door, slid into the premium leather driver's seat, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life with a deep, satisfying hum. I shifted into gear and accelerated out of the church compound, leaving the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers far behind me in the rearview mirror. I merged onto the highway, driving smoothly into the glowing Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretched out before me, vast and full of opportunity. I was no longer a silent financial compliant. I was no longer the family outcast begging for a seat at a toxic table. I was the architect of my own empire, financially untouchable, completely victorious, and forever free.